Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Dr. Dennis Plowman was furious. He'd never felt so incensed in his entire life. His blood was boiling, his breathing raspy and constricted. It would seem taunting images of his beautiful wife Anne flashed before his eyes, like a video being played out in his head. He pictured how distressed she would become when he had his little chat with her this evening, which brought over uncomfortable waves of guilt that he could not relinquish. He had let her down badly. He was financially responsible for his beloved wife and their 4-year-old boy Mathis, as well as the baby on its way, the soon-to-be new bundle of joy to add to the family. What would be the consequences of this devastating news? What would it do to Anne? He dreaded to think. A bitter nausea washed over the back of his throat. He felt certain he'd be violently sick, and there was no anti-nausea medication on the entire planet that could shift this repugnant taste, or the vacuous thorny hollow that had clawed its way up into his gut. What would he tell Anne? And more to the point, how was he going to tell her? This was his greatest concern. The revelation was not going to go down well with her, that was for sure. It was not the kind of news that anyone would gladly welcome, even at the very best of times. It certainly wasn't good for pregnant women to have any stress during pregnancy, and now he was piling her plate magnanimously, with the meat and potatoes of worry and uncertainty. Anne was already suffering greatly from swollen feet. The baby was causing her lower back to ache, with the extra pregnancy weight she was carrying mainly in her front, which he had been informed by someone in the know meant his wife was probably expecting a boy. He couldn't believe it had come to this. Who knew a day could be like a piece of paper, so cruelly torn to shreds in no time at all, and thrown away in the wastepaper basket as if it had not meant anything at all. He was allowed to be mad. He wouldn't be human if he wasn't. The day had been unassuming, like any other, in its straightforward, predictable rhythms at the dental surgery. Dennis had 2 patients before 12 p.m. Things had run as smoothly as a stream meandering over its rocky course. Nothing to suggest that, like a glass of milk in the sun, it would soon turn rancidly sour. Dennis had been cordially invited to lunch with his business partner, Dr. Adrian Coutts, who worked with him at the surgery. The lunch engagements were common between the two friends, as Dennis considered Adrian Coutts to be one of his best friends. Not for a moment had he envisaged what an unpalatable lunch this would ultimately turn out to be. Soon he would leave the restaurant with poison in his gut that did not come from some listeria in the food. This kind of poisoning was brought on by distasteful words. These words were like bullets that had the power to be loaded into a rifle, and with one pull of the trigger could cruelly blow your life apart. Dr. Adrian Coutts, whom had initially asked him to come into business with him as another dentist for his private practice, was about to let him down in ways he had never envisaged possible, and more to the point, at the worst timing imaginable. The 2 men had studied dentistry together and known each other for many years. Dr. Coots had taken out a large loan with the bank to set up a private dental practice of his own in the town of Portland. The cost of all the accessories, dental chairs, x-ray machines, computers, medical supplies, and all that paraphernalia had cost an arm and a leg. They'd been running the business for 7 years now. Things had looked promising in the very beginning, but with a huge dental clinic that had started up adjacent to them 2 years ago, it had rudely emerged like a thorny perennial weed thrusting itself through a flowery meadow, obnoxious, ugly, and unwelcome. Their adversary was offering cheaper prices than they did. As a result, over the last few months, the success of Adrian Coots's dental surgery had plummeted. Many of their current clientele had strayed, opting to go for the cheaper costs offered by their competitors. How do you compete with big business? It's impossible. People these days had become very cost-conscious. They weren't looking for a dentist they had a good rapport with, who cared about them personally as a patient. That was a plus, of course, but most were looking for a skilled dentist who could do the root canal for the most cost-effective price. It wasn't surprising that dentists had some of the highest suicide rates in America. It was a cutthroat industry. It would seem their overheads were so expensive, and with the hefty monthly instalments, Dr. Adrian Coots was still paying back to the bank with a cumulative interest. Things had not smelt rosy for the practice. By all accounts, things were rapidly going downhill, like a falling pack of cards fast. They simply couldn't afford to slim down their dental prices for their customers, much as they would have liked to, without compromising on the quality of their dental materials. Adrian Coots rightly refused to use inferior products on people's teeth. The big dental practice over the road seemed to have the upper hand. Adrian Coots had been forced to make some adjustments to cut down his expenditures. He'd been forced to let go of one of the receptionists, along with the dental hygienist, a woman called Philippa McRange, who had a hissy fit when Adrian had given her marching orders. Letting go of people was not a pretty business. From now on, both dentists would do the dental cleaning on their clients. Dennis never imagined that when Adrian Coots was making cutbacks in his surgery, that he would be the next unfortunate victim on the receiving end of that hit list. Soon he would know exactly how Philippa McRange had felt when Adrian Coots had told her that her services were no longer required. The Friday lunch had begun so nicely. The atmosphere of the modest, unembellished Italian restaurant, Al Dente, had been swingingly convivial, with the fragrant smell of oregano, tomato sauce, garlic and melted mozzarella wafting around the restaurant, causing stomachs to rumble in eager anticipation of the culinary banquet yet to grace their tables. No one ever left Al Dente's disappointed, but it would be very different today. One man would leave the tables with his tail between his legs, feeling as if his whole life had been cruelly shattered into smithereens. At Al Dente's there was always a bubble of chatter, the trillful high notes of sing-song laughter, the tinkle of knives and forks, the drum-like clatter of china, and the light ethereal pinging of glasses that formed a tuneful orchestra of background sounds, the sounds of contented people thoroughly enjoying their food. Al Dente's was a private little enterprise that had boomed exponentially, with a sweet elderly Italian couple from Tuscany running the helm of their business, like two very skilled ship's captains. It would seem that 79-year-old Francesca De Lucia was a culinary queen, creating very authentic Italian cuisine that was to die for. People flocked to Al Dente's to enjoy their traditional Italian fare. They served fabulously rich, full-bodied red house wine, and the tables were always simply decked out with red and white check tablecloths. The cheerful vibe in the restaurant was contagious, and always popular on a Friday afternoon, when the day offered the promise of a blissful, lackadaisical weekend ahead. Dennis noticed that Adrian looked very fidgety, as if he wanted to say something, but was struggling to find the words. Dennis had never seen his friend look so out of sorts. The waitress who served them recognized Dennis at once and gave him a big, warm smile. She was a willowy young woman with long legs like a giraffe, and equally as bedazzling eyelashes that framed her brown eyes that were so obviously false. "You're Dennis Plowman, aren't you? Dr. Dennis Plowman," she giggled. "I thought I recognized you. I don't know if you remember me, do you? I'm Claudette Glendowine. I got in touch with your surgery a year ago, begging for you to see me. I was in excruciating pain. I don't know if you remember. It turned out you had to give me a root canal, along with a course of antibiotics. I hasten to say you saved my life, Dr. Plowman, and for that I'm eternally grateful. The other dental practice over the road from you, the one in that big nondescript beige building, well, they wouldn't see me. Can you believe it? They said I had to book 6 months in advance for an appointment. She said, rolling her eyes in abject disgust. I told them I was in pain, that it was an emergency, but they didn't seem to give a damn. They couldn't have cared less. But Mr. Plowman, you saved the day for me. You told me to come in at once. Let me tell you, that tooth pain was like nothing else I have ever experienced in my entire life. They say toothache is worse than giving birth, but you rescued me from the pain of a hellish experience that I'll never forget. Well, I'm glad we could be of help, said Dennis, smiling ruefully, knowing that they were probably able to help, as their books were not exactly congested with bookings, unlike their competitors, and he'd always made cancellations if urgent cases arose. He considered Claudette's words. You're right. There's nothing worse than a pain from an infected tooth. I have seen grown men cry like babies with toothache. The pain can be insufferable. I know women who have told me that giving birth to their own children was easier than coping with the pain from an infected abscess. Claudette's eyes squinted in the prism of afternoon sunlight that streamed audaciously through the window of the restaurant. She rested her hands on her hips. I ask you, Dr. Plowman, how did they survive back in the 1800s when they had an infected tooth? God only knows. Well, many of them died, didn't they? Said Dennis Plowman. Unless, of course, they pulled the tooth out. But even then you could so easily pull the wrong tooth out. That was a big problem, as you can't actually always identify where the pain is coming from, or in truth, which tooth is actually causing the problem. It requires a great deal of testing to decide which tooth is the offender. People can get it horribly wrong. Dentistry has luckily come a long way since then. I guess in the 1800s, they played guesswork with people's teeth, pulling out sometimes several dozen, until the patient was fully satisfied that the pain had finally gone. Well, I'm glad I didn't live back then. I'd have been taken out a long time ago, Dr. Plowman. My teeth have always given me problems. I don't even drink soda. I do everything right, but I'm always getting holes in my teeth like some people get ladders in their stockings. Now let me take your orders, gentlemen. I would like to recommend the gnocchi today. It's excellent, she said, smacking her lips in a dramatic gesture of appreciation. It's light and airy. And of course it goes without saying that you won't find any other Italian restaurant that makes pizzas quite like al dente's do, this side of Portland, and that is a promise. Pizza it is, then, said Dennis, smiling. I'll have a margherita with pastrami. And you, sir, what would you like? Asked Claudette, who was looking directly at Dr. Adrian Coutts, who appeared to be staring out of the window blankly, as if his mind was otherwise engaged. Dennis could see he was glancing at the large dental surgery, a little further down the road, strategically positioned opposite the Adrian Coutts dental practice. Adrian's jaw stiffened, his eyes narrowed like a spiteful cat that had murder on his mind. It was clear he despised the dental practice who had stolen so many of his clients away, without even batting an eyelid, and they had no shame to boot. Sorry, sir, repeated the waitress, looking at Adrian. What would you like? Adrian shrugged his shoulders. Sorry, I was miles away for a moment. The gnocchi sounds just perfect. Excellent choice, said Claudette, retrieving their menus and scribbling down Adrian's order on her notepad. When she returned to their table, she presented both men with steaming dishes of delectable food, and giggling she nudged Dennis and said, I asked the cook to give you extra pastrami on your pizza. You were so good to me over my infected tooth. I don't forget anyone who rescues me from pain in a hurry. You'll always be my hero, Dr. Plowman. Thank you, said Dennis, smiling warmly at Claudette. Enjoy your food, she said, scurrying off. Adrian lifted up the mouth-watering pizza slice into his mouth, and the melted oregano and cheese and pastrami titillated his taste buds. It was absolutely delicious, and quite simply the best pizza he'd ever tasted. Adrian Coutts's face was ashen, and trembling he took a sip of his red wine, putting it down on the table and looking directly at Dennis. Little did Dennis know that in any second now his life would begin to fall apart like a ladder in a pair of tights that rips through the sheer fabric. "You know that I've been having to make cutbacks," said Adrian gingerly. "I'm afraid, Dennis, I'm going to have to let you go." Dennis began to laugh. "You're joking, right?" he said, biting into his pizza. "You're having me on. This is a joke." The two dentists often wound each other up. Adrian's expression was sober. There was no glint of humour in his grass-coloured green eyes. "I'm not joking, Dennis. I'm being deadly serious, I'm afraid. I'm asking you to go. I can't afford to keep you on in the practice any longer. You know I've been forced to make some uncomfortable cutbacks recently. And simply put, I can't afford to keep you on. It's as simple as that." "You are kidding me. After all I've done for you." "What exactly have you done for me?" asked Adrian, raising a dark caterpillar brow. "With the greatest of respect, most of our clientele, whose teeth you've been treating, are actually mine. You haven't brought much business to the practice yourself, on your own merits. I asked you to come into my business, Dennis, as I thought the business would prosper, and you're an excellent dentist. It was great having you on board, and I've enjoyed working with you. We've made a very good team together. But the truth is I can't ignore the elephant in the room any longer, and with the cutthroat competitive competition out there, I just cannot afford to keep you on. There is only enough business to keep myself busy. It's not personal. I'll give you great references, of course, but I'm sorry it has come to this. I hope that won't sour our friendship." "I've done a lot for you, Adrian, and this is how you treat me," said Dennis obsequiously. "If it wasn't for me, you'd never have met your wife 10 years ago. Don't forget that. Nor would you have your 2 children. I was the one that invited you to Liza Macpherson's party, if you remember. When you wanted me to introduce you to your wife, I went out of my way to do so, as she was my sister's friend. I set the 2 of you up together on a date, and gave your wife a push to go out with you. She wasn't even interested in you in the beginning. She said you weren't her type, but I begged her to go on that date with you for a special favour. Put it this way, without my invaluable contribution, you might never have met her. I'm very grateful for that, Dennis. Really I am. I keep telling you it's not personal. I'm not laying you off now as I speak. I'm giving you advance notice. You've got until the end of the month to make other arrangements. Plenty of time. Any dentistry out there would be lucky to have you. I'm sure you will be snapped up in no time at all." Dennis pushed his pizza away from him, as if it had suddenly turned into a bowl of grey sludge that he couldn't possibly digest. It slid across the tablecloth towards Dr. Coots. His food no longer seemed remotely palatable, as a bitter bile coated his throat. His chest was constricting so tightly that he could barely breathe, while his trembling hands had become moist and clammy. "I'm suddenly not terribly hungry. Some friend you are, Adrian. Talk about kicking a dog when he's down. In case you've forgotten, my wife has a bun in the oven. She's due to give birth very shortly, and I've got a 4-year-old boy to take care of. I need this job. It's not easy out there. It's a minefield, and you know it is, especially in our industry. Look, as I keep saying, Dennis, this is not personal. I have to let you go. I wish it didn't have to be like this, I really do, but it is what it is. If our business had been prosperous, everything would be different. You know it would. But that dental practice over the road from us, with their insanely cheap, very questionable prices, has drowned us. Sometimes you have to cut your losses. I can't afford you. So I'm surplus to requirements, am I? Oh, please don't feed me all this baloney, Adrian." Dennis got up from the table, pushing the chair away from him so loudly that it scratched the parquet floor fiercely. He raised himself up onto his feet, and with an indignant, dramatic swagger, stormed out of the restaurant with Claudette running behind him. "Is everything all right, Dr. Plowman? I see you've left your pizza. Did you not like it? Was there too much pastrami on it? I can fix it if you like. It's no trouble at all. Really, it isn't." "There was nothing wrong with the pizza, Claudette. It was absolutely delicious. It was the company I was keeping that was badly tainted. He dipped into his wallet and brought out a $5 note, which he handed to Claudette. Thank you for the great service. If you want to know what's going on, that man over there sitting with me at the table, my so-called business partner, has just fired me from our dental practice. I'm livid. I've worked for him for 7 years now. I'm a damn good dentist, and he's just dumped me, thrown me out with the dirty bathwater. He brought me out to lunch to tell me I'm surplus to requirements, redundant to the practice. He doesn't need me anymore. I have a wife with a baby on the way, and he does this to me.
Claudette gasped with astonishment, her hands cupping her mouth. The bloody cheek! How dare he dump you like that? You're a damn good dentist. Don't mind me, she said. I'm going to give that nasty piece of work a piece of my mind. Men like him make me sick. Think they can treat their staff like dishwater and get away with it? Dennis watched Claudette marching defiantly over to Adrian Coutts and could see her giving him the riot act. To his surprise, she snatched the glass of red wine he'd been drinking from him and flung it into his face. The man looked completely bewildered as the red wine dribbled down his face and turned his white shirt a pink colour. His green eyes were popping out of their sockets. He was flushing with embarrassment as every eye in the restaurant was fixed on him. What did you do that for? He growled under his breath. Everyone is staring at me. He hurriedly mopped his face with a paper napkin. Dennis chuckled. Serves the loser right, he thought. Good for Claudette. It was good that someone was fighting his corner for him. She was waving her arms around like a frenzied octopus and pointing her fingers accusingly at Adrian Coutts, which attracted the attention of all the diners. Claudette had Italian ancestry, that was clear. Not only in her long dark hair and honeyed complexion could you see it, but her fiery personality as well. Her frenzied fury was bubbling over like an inferno, and amusing the customers who clearly thought she was a spurned lover, who was extracting her revenge on a cheating lowlife. And some of the customers were cheering her, saying, You go, girl, good for you. Hope he gets what's coming to him. Claudette barked at Adrian. Mr. Plowman saved my life when I had an excruciating toothache, and you're getting rid of him? Firing him, are you? That's insane. Just so you know, I shall not be supporting your dental practice any longer. You've let go of such a fine dentist whose wife is pregnant at the moment. You should be ashamed of yourself. Who does that with any heart? That man saved my life, and you're dumping him. What on earth is wrong with you? You don't understand, said Adrian. I didn't have a choice in the matter. That's bull, and you know it. Everybody has a choice. Claudette turned around to the customers who were watching the scene unfolding before them. She piped, You see this loser over here? He's only been seeing 3 other women behind my back. Which created the reaction she'd hoped for, as people gasped, shook their heads, and cast Adrian some disdainful looks. Some clapped and cheered. You're well rid of him, love, came a gentleman's voice. You need that man like a hole in the head. As Dennis sank into the comfortable leather seats of his GMC Sierra, he felt as if his life had been swallowed up, like the plankton in a whale's mouth. For a brief moment he sat in his truck, staring absent-mindedly into space. His eyes focused on the dental practice on the opposite side of the road from the private surgery, where he'd worked with Dr. Adrian Coutts. He could see a plethora of clients going inside that practice, like hornets returning to their nest. He suddenly felt such hatred and loathing for the opposing practice, as if he'd like to douse the whole place in flames and seeing it burn to the ground, so that all that was left of the ugly building was a pile of grey ashes. It was large businesses like this, owned by big corporate shareholders, that were driving small businesses like Adrian Coutts's into the ground. These big medical enterprises could afford to offer their clients lower prices, so that smaller businesses were unfairly crushed and often forced to shut down their doors. Adrian glanced up at the lugubrious sky that had become ashen, just like he felt, and in the distance the thunder groaned and grumbled, as if this bad day was infectious, almost as if the sombre, very grim mood was highly contagious. There was definitely something in the water today, he thought. He saw 2 very disgruntled young women standing outside a Nissan truck, on the street where he was parked, screaming the odds at each other.
He'd seen them in the Italian restaurant only moments before. "You stole my money, Hilda. I know you did. I went into the ladies' room for just a moment, and while I was away you dipped into my purse. I mean, how low can you get?" said the woman, lashing out at her friend furiously. "You're nothing short of a common thief, and you have a rich husband. You don't even need money, but you took it just for the hell of it. It's all a big game for you, isn't it, Hilda? A little bit of fun for your personal entertainment in your boringly dull, privileged life." Hilda growled in retaliation like a cornered dog. "I never took your money. You probably didn't have the money in the first place, and you're making it up." "Don't put words in my mouth, Hilda. You stole $100 from my purse. It was there only moments ago, and I want it back now, or I'm going to call the police." In a trice, a violent scuffle broke out in the parking lot, with two women pulling each other's hair and calling each other unmentionable names that contaminated the air with their foulness, like a bad, obtrusive smell. Soon a surly-looking parking attendant came waddling along the street, like a disenchanted duck. He had greasy hair and piggy eyes, with 3 folding layers of skin hanging under his chin, like a turkey's neck. It would seem his extended girth was so large that the buttons looked like they were about to burst off his shirt. Maybe he'd been overdoing it with the pizzas at al dente's. He looked at the two women with an expression of annoyed frustration dappling his perspiring face, which he kept mopping up with his hanky. This was clearly not the first time he'd had to stop an altercation, and it wouldn't be the last. "Would you kindly refrain, ladies, from making a public spectacle of yourselves, or I will call the police." "She started it," said Hilda, pointing accusingly at the brunette, with her defiant brown eyes, whose mouth was quivering with anger. "She's the one that's blaming me for stealing her money." "I think it's best if you leave now," said the parking attendant. "I'm not interested in what you're fighting about. I don't need you upsetting the peace around here with your futile shenanigans. People are trying to enjoy their food at al dente's, and there are business around here along the street who won't appreciate the drama you're causing." "Don't you worry. I'm going," said Hilda abrasively, tossing her manicured mane of blonde bobbed hair and grabbing her keys out of her Chanel bag. She trotted defiantly towards her white Mercedes with a pugnacious swing to her step. Goodness gracious, thought Dennis, watching the scene unfold before his eyes. This Hilda woman drives a white Mercedes and has been accused of stealing $100 from her friend. I wonder if she did take it. She looks a little sly to me. Was it possible she was so wealthy she got some kind of euphoric kick from stealing from her friend? Like a bored, lonely housewife with nothing better to do to amuse herself. He'd heard about women like that before. Both women got off into their trucks, slamming the pedals of their accelerators down and driving away so treacherously that they grazed the asphalt road in a stretch of long black lines. Dennis knew he needed to get home. The sky was beginning to cry, as tears spurted out of the clouds. At first they were reluctant, and then suddenly it poured as if the earth itself was shuddering violently from a downpour of tears, as if it too was commiserating with what had been a very inauspicious Friday, not just for Dennis, but for so many, it would seem. Misery loved company, and today misery was clinging to anything it could attach itself to, like a tenacious vine strangling a rosebush. Soon lightning forked across the sky, punching the gunmetal canopy into a firework display of yellow zigzags. The thunder boomed, and the rain pelted down, while the grey roads in Portland gleamed and glistened under the deluge. Dennis made his way to the Forest Park neighbourhood, which is slap bang in the middle of Portland, and is comprised of over 5,000 acres of forest woodland, bountifully abundant with a plethora of cycling and equestrian trails, and is filled with all kinds of indigenous wild animals, from squirrels to chipmunk, elk and bobcats, along with a vibrant amount of exquisite birds. It was late afternoon, and the grimly overcast sky was sulking, like a crotchety old man. It seemed set to stay, but the rain showers had suddenly abated, like a faucet that is switched off quickly at your kitchen sink. The rubber tyres of Dennis's car lifted up pools of water on the road, It whooshed through the puddles, unfortunately spraying a less than enamoured woman on the sidewalk, who gave him a dagger-like stare and raised a rude finger sign at him. Adrian could see there was mud all over her jeans. He felt bad, as he hadn't seen her. Moments later, as he was getting close to home, he saw the little boy, his neighbour's 5-year-old kid Tyler, trotting across the road. Dennis could not stop in time. He slammed his foot on the brake, which screeched in protest. His car skidded forward across the asphalt, leaving behind ugly black drag marks. Dennis was waiting for that dreadful low thudding sound you get when you run over something. For a moment his heart leapt into his throat. It would seem even though his reaction time was swift, it was just too late. The brakes weren't working fast enough. He was about to kill or seriously injure a 5-year-old boy, and there was nothing he could do about it. But the hands of fate skillfully intervened. He was not prepared for what happened next, that interrupted this momentous sequence of events. A huge, ponderous creature plunged into his line of vision, seconds before the inevitable impact. The ambiguous creature he knew at once was a Bigfoot was covered in a cinnamon-coloured long, shaggy coat. He was about 8 foot tall, built like a giant. It lunged into the road, scooping up the little boy in his arms and jumping away from the truck in the nick of time, saving Tyler from almost certain death. The lofty, majestic-looking Bigfoot tossed Tyler casually over his shoulders, like a small sack of potatoes. The boy's face was ashen, as if he comprehended how close he'd come to being run over. He was crying. The Bigfoot seemed to be patting his back as if to console him. The Bigfoot glided straight into the woods with little Tyson over his shoulders. For a brief second, the Bigfoot turned around and eyeballed Dennis, looking at him through deep-set, treacle-coloured eyes, as if to say, "Look what you've done. You nearly killed the boy." At least Dennis had the decency to blush with shame. He'd not been going that fast, but he knew unequivocally that if the very quick-witted creature had not rescued Tyler in time, he would almost certainly have been pulverised under his tyres. But the boy had come running into the road from nowhere. He had not seen him before it was too late. How could the Bigfoot move so fast? For a moment he sat in his car bemused and stunned, just shaking from the shock of what could have potentially transpired. Dennis's whole body wobbled like a jelly. His heart pounded violently in his chest. That was close, he thought, far too close for comfort. Next time I drive down this road again, I will go lower than the recommended speed limit, he told himself. There are too many kids around here. This can never ever happen again. I could have killed little Tyler. Then his thoughts wandered over to the Bloombergs. How could he possibly tell them a Bigfoot had abducted their son? They would think he was smoking something, and worse still, he'd have to admit he nearly ran over their child. Everything had happened so fast, it was so surreal, and even Dennis wondered whether it really did happen at all. This had indeed been one of the most outlandish days of his entire life. Certainly not a typical Friday afternoon. Dennis knew his wife would know exactly what he should do. He was dreading going home to her with his sobering news, but nearly running over a child put everything into perspective. Now the object of his primary focus and concern was the Bloombergs, who would likely discover that little Tyler was missing, and there was nothing worse for any parent than a missing child. But how could any parent possibly digest the news that a Bigfoot had taken their boy into the woods? Would the parents ever believe him? It was highly doubtful. Would he believe someone popping over to his house, saying they'd seen his son Mathis being abducted by a Bigfoot? Of course he wouldn't believe them. When Dennis parked his car in the garage and made his way to the front door, he glanced nervously at the neighbour's property. His heart sank as he saw Mrs. Bloomberg calling out for her child. "Tyler! Tyler!" she was calling out. "Where the hell are you? You haven't gone looking for that damn cat again, have you?" Dennis had seen enough. He was racked with guilt. He hurriedly plundered his keys into the lock and opened the door. He could hear the sound of the television blaring. He dropped his keys on the entrance hall table and ambled over to the living room. His wife Anne was relaxing on the couch with her legs cradled up to her chest and wearing a large maternity smock that covered her ample bump. Their 4-year-old boy Mathis was watching cartoons on the television and playing with his toy trucks at the same time across the parquet floor, happily making those brimming sounds that children tend to make. Anne looked up in surprise to see her husband. "You're home early, sweetheart. I did think I heard your truck in the driveway and your keys tinkling on the entrance hall table, but I told myself I had to be mistaken. But here you are."
"It's been quite the day," said Dennis. "The kind of day you would pray to God would never ever repeat itself in the history of your life."
"That bad? Difficult patient?" she asked.
"Something like that," said Dennis, not wishing to go into details about being laid off by the likes of Adrian Kutz. That could wait. Right now he had more pressing issues at stake.
The only thing he could think about right now was Tyler being rescued and then abducted by a Bigfoot. The parents needed to know what had happened to their son. But how could he tell them something like this?
"Something's happened," said Dennis. "Something bad."
"What?" said Anne, sitting up, clutching her stomach, as if Dennis's ominous words had personally caused her physical pain. "You're scaring me," she said, her face growing white. "What happened? For God's sake, put me out of my misery. I'm dying right here."
"I nearly ran over the Bloomberg's kid. Their 5-year-old boy, Tyler. You know the one. He's a cute little boy. He just dashed out into the road. I couldn't bloody stop in time."
"You what?" gasped Anne, clasping her hands around her mouth. "You didn't! My God! Poor Tyler!"
"I would have run him right over if he hadn't been rescued by a Bigfoot."
Anne looked at her husband and wagged her fingers at Dennis. "If this is your idea of a joke, Dennis, it's not funny. You've just given me a heart attack."
"Anne, do I look like I'm laughing?"
"You're telling me that you nearly ran over the Bloomberg's boy, and a Bigfoot rescued him in the nick of time by a hair's breadth? Is that what you're really saying? And I'm expected to believe that?"
"That's exactly what I'm saying. But there is the problem. The Bigfoot abducted him. I cannot say anything, can I, to the Bloombergs? Imagine me walking over there right now and saying, 'By the way, I nearly ran over Tyler, and he was rescued by a Bigfoot, and now he's been abducted, taken into the woods by the creature. Sorry, just thought I'd tell you.'"
Anne sat up with a start. "I'll go over and see them right now. I'll pop around with some of my homemade shortbread. I'll feel my way around, so to speak."
"What will you say?"
"I have no idea. I'll play it by ear. I think it would be wise to tell them the truth. Of course, they don't have to believe us, but it's important to tell them what we know." Dennis was relieved his wife would handle the problem for him, as the last thing he wanted right now was to deal with two distressed, overwrought parents. The day was already collapsing in on him. His little boy, Mathis, was calling out to him. "Daddy, Daddy, will you come and play trucks with me? I want you to try and crash into me. We can have a police chase. You can be the very, very bad man, and I'll be the sheriff that arrests you."
"Sounds like fun," said Dennis, getting onto the floor to play with his son.
"I'd better get going," said Anne, clutching her stomach and staggering to her feet. She felt like a hippo. Her stomach was very extended. Who knew pregnancy would be such hard work? She was sure she was giving birth to an entire NFL football team. Every part of her body ached, especially her lower back. She manoeuvred herself awkwardly into the kitchen and waddled over to the countertop. She gathered some of the shortbread she'd baked for the weekend that was cooling on the wire racks and placed a large selection of it in a Tupperware container for the Bloombergs, the quintessential excuse to pop over to their house for a fleeting visit, she thought. So there she was, trotting up the Bloomberg asphalt driveway. The house seemed remarkably silent. Its soundlessness almost screamed out at Anne, flooding her with a growing sense of wary unease. Usually when she popped around to the Bloomberg house, it sounded like a household inundated with rambunctious, spirited, screaming kids, running around noisily, as the Bloombergs had 3 children, and 5-year-old Tyler was the youngest. The composed ranch-style home stood there stoically, under the lingering shadows of the late afternoon or early evening. It was certainly dark enough to assume the latter. The afterglow smell of the rain seemed to impregnate the earth, with its fragrant dewy smells. The sky was a gunmetal grey, exuding a stormy, cantankerous appearance. It released a belligerent, pugnacious grumble that descended audaciously through the clouds, as if another storm was now brewing. It was as if the neighbourhood wobbled in submission under its growing threats, like surrendering to the demands of a draconian headmistress. It seemed as if there was no young lives dwelling under its expansive roof, and the silence of the house was poignant, but Anne's fears would soon be allayed. She found herself rapping at the front door, and then it was flung open by Mrs. Bloomberg, who gave Anne a bright, warm smile. Anne was surprised that anyone was at home. The house had seemed remarkably quiet. "This is a surprise, Anne. It's lovely to see you. What are you doing here? I hope you've popped around for a decaffeinated coffee." Anne could hear the kids racing around the place, screaming, shouting and laughing, unleashing the noises that kids tend to make. The house on the outside had seemed remarkably still, so peaceful and tranquil, but on the inside the reverse was true. It had become like a chaotically busy train station, with kids' screams and laughs bouncing around the place like inebriated frogs. Mrs. Bloomberg looked relaxed, and didn't appear unduly overwrought or anxious about anything. Did she not know that Tyler was missing yet? Had she not realized her kid was gone? "I just brought you some shortbread. I made a whole batch, and with your 3 children, I thought they might enjoy some cookies." "How kind of you, Anne. You're 8 months pregnant, and you're making the neighbours' kids shortbread. You're a good lady. You should be worrying about that little one you're carrying, not us. Have you got time for that cuppa? I could do with some adult company, and my husband won't be back for a couple of hours yet, so I'd love to have a nice adult chat." "That would be lovely," said Anne, coming hesitantly into the house. Mrs. Bloomberg beckoned for her to sit at the breakfast nook, after she removed some tired copies of the Wall Street Journal from the seat. Anne watched Mrs. Bloomberg bustling around the hob busily with a kettle in her hands and setting out the coffee mugs onto the counter. "You know, Anne, I've always wanted to be a mother," she was saying. "I find raising children is a lonely business, though. Sometimes you crave adult company. When I saw you standing outside the front door, I thought all my Christmases had come at once. My first thought was another adult to talk to, at last. How perfectly wonderful of you to pop around. The kids have been driving me mad recently. I'm surprised the hair on my head hasn't turned completely grey. The stress they put me through sometimes, you don't want to know. I'm permanently having mini heart attacks." "I know what you mean," said Anne, tapping her fingers nervously on the breakfast nook. "How's Tyler?" she asked suddenly, deciding to blow all caution to the wind. "I'm here," said a cute little boy entering the kitchen, with a beleaguered look on his little face. In his hands he was carrying a model aircraft. "Look, Mummy, look what Douglas did. He broke its wing. He did it on purpose because I wouldn't let him play with my truck." On seeing the little boy, Anne flooded with relief. Was her husband mistaken? Perhaps it was not one of the Bloomberg boys that had been nearly run over in his car. Maybe it was someone else, another neighbourhood kid perhaps, that had been abducted by a Bigfoot. Mrs. Bloomberg examined the broken wing. "We'll get your father to look at it for you when he comes back home. Now run along, will you?" The little boy obediently scuttled away. "That kid," she said, raising a brow at Anne and putting down a mug of decaffeinated coffee before her. "That kid possibly has given me more heart attacks than any of my other children. I mean, this afternoon, only about 35 minutes ago or so, after that sudden rain shower we had, Tyler vanished from the house. I tried to keep the kids contained, and my eyes on them all the time, but it's never easy. It turned out he'd gone waddling across the street to look for Sylvester, our cat. It's very dangerous for him to cross that road all on his own. I've warned him over and over again never to do that without Mummy and Daddy being there. But he never listens. And as for that cat Sylvester, he's as bad and mischievous as my own son, sprinting across the road at will to climb one of the oak trees in the wood grove, which has become like a watchtower to him. He likes to watch the comings and goings on the street from that tree. So I ran out of the house looking for my Tyler, and then I see him, running out towards me from the wood grove, with a huge smile on his face. I wanted to slap him, I was so angry. He knew he was in trouble, but he didn't seem to care at all. He came back telling me this crazy, outlandish story. Mrs. Bloomberg shook her mane of curls. I think he's dreaming up all these fanciful excuses in order to avoid getting into trouble. Why, what did he say? Asked Anne curiously. her attention now very alert. "Oh, he said Sylvester ran across the road, and he ran after him, and this car came out of nowhere and nearly hit him. He said King Kong rescued him, gave him a ride all over the woodgrove. He said King Kong was very, very nice. He asked the creature for more rides on his big shoulders, but King Kong said he better get back home. His mother might be worried about him. Aren't children funny? The things they come out with." Anne sighed with relief. She could return home, comfortable in the full knowledge that Tyler was safely back home, having been returned by the Bigfoot, who clearly had no intention of abducting him. The creature had saved the little child's life, but such knowledge the Bloombergs would never be privy to, as sometimes ignorance is bliss. "Well," said Dennis when Anne finally returned home, "how did it go with the Bloombergs?" He was pleased his wife was wearing a convivial expression on her face, as his chest was so tight. He had dreadful visions of the Bloombergs and police searching in earnest for their son, but his wife's mellow, lackadaisical expression told him at once that all was well. "Well, only Sally Bloomberg was there. Her husband was still at work. She told me that Tyler nearly got run down by a truck, which must have been you, but was rescued by King Kong, who gave him a shoulder ride in the woods and then told him that he needed to go home. Of course, Sally thinks Tyler's spouting nonsense, but she had no idea Tyler was telling her the truth." 2 weeks later, Dennis had put the word out about looking for a dental position in a surgery, and decided it wasn't in his interest to share the news with his wife about being laid off by Adrian Coots. He had almost succeeded in mowing down one little boy. He didn't want to be responsible for causing any further damage, especially to his baby, that was so close to being born, by causing his wife any undue stress. Then a wonderful thing happened by magic that he'd never anticipated, as an old friend of his, who ran an established dental practice, was looking to recruit another dentist, as they were so overbooked they couldn't manage the heavy workload. Now Dennis could relax, as the stresses of the previous month were now fully allayed. It was on a Thursday morning that Anne opened the door to a very excited Mrs. Bloomberg. She barged right into the house, her face aflutter with excitement. "You won't believe what happened only a moment ago. I was driving my truck out of the driveway with Tyler at my side, and I saw this big silhouette. It looked right at me in the car. It was a Bigfoot, Anne. It was a Bigfoot. I am not kidding you. You will not believe it, Anne. He waved at me. My son was saying, 'There's my friend King Kong.' Can you believe it? It was such a beautiful, lofty creature, so majestic, with the kindest dark eyes I've ever seen, and such a human face. I just can't get over the fact it was waving directly at me, as if I was its very best friend." Anne chuckled to herself. It wasn't waving at you, you daft woman, she thought. It was waving at your son. It knows your son. It doesn't know you. Haven't you got it yet? So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I knew my mother was acting strangely that morning. It all began at breakfast time, when I was sitting at the breakfast nook eating my bowl of popped cereal. I was 15 years old at the time, and it was a transfixing Saturday morning, with the soft shafts of radiant sunlight sprinkling audaciously through the broad French windows of our cottage-style home in Nebraska, casting shimmering shadows over our kitchen. My large black poodle Mix, Ruggs, was lying over my feet, his soft fur bristling against me with a pleasing warmth, while the instrumental music of the radio was playing soulfully in the background, with a gentle drumming beat that wasn't catchy enough to make you want to dance or tap to its rhythmic flow, but it was satisfying enough to listen to, as it had an upbeat feel about it, which always put you in a positive frame of mind. My mother always played background music. She told me once that was because someone was always playing the flute when she was growing up as a girl, but she never ever expanded on those intimate details. "Who was playing the flute?" I'd ask her, and she would just say, "I don't want to go into that." She was a closed book about her childhood, having told me from a young age that both of her parents had been killed tragically in a plane crash. She never talked about her parents, or even about her young life growing up as a young girl. Whenever I asked her any awkward questions, she shut me down immediately, with a cursory remark like, "I don't want to talk about that right now, if you don't mind." The trouble was she never wanted to talk about anything that was associated with her past, as if she was nursing a clandestine secret that she did not want to divulge. I was an inquisitive, inquiring young boy, an only child, who was naturally interested in my biological roots, but my mother was never forthcoming, nor did she ever expand on her young life. Worse still, there were no photographs of herself as a young girl, to give me any insight or brief overview of her past, nor were there any pictures of my grandparents that I found exceedingly odd. I wasn't fooled by my mother's contemptuous, disdainful indifference towards her past. All the apathetic, vague, ambiguous responses that she credited our conversations with had made me acutely aware that she was hiding something from me. But what? That was the $1,001 question. I had promptly decided that when I was old enough, I'd find out exactly what it was that she was concealing from me. But until then, I would very graciously let sleeping dogs lie, just to keep the peace. My mother did not take kindly to having her feathers ruffled, so I knew better than to badger her. My bull-headed mother could be mulishly stubborn at times and obstinate if she chose to be, and if she didn't want to tell you something, she would perversely clam up like an oyster in a shell, and there was no getting through to her. My mother had divorced my father when I was only 4 years old, and although my father phoned me once or twice a year, I never got to see him much. My dad had since remarried and had 3 children of his own, and I felt estranged from his life. He was always half-heartedly promising me that I must come to visit his family at some point, but his indeterminate, hazy promises were airy-fairy and never amounted to any solid invitations. I didn't think it was my place to presumptuously invite myself to his home in New Jersey, where he lived with his family. Never mind the fact that I had 2 half-brothers and 1 half-sister, whom I surely had the right to meet. As for my grandparents on my father's side of the family, they did make a special effort to visit me once or twice a year, and for that I was exceedingly grateful. But growing up, it pretty much felt like it was me and my mother against the entire world, the 2 of us in this self-contained bubble called life, and that could make me feel isolated and alone. I simply loathed it when friends of mine unintentionally caused me grievous upset by indiscriminately talking about aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents that would be enjoying Thanksgiving and Christmas with them. I'd feel the green-eyed monster making its ugly appearance known again. My lips would quiver, my jaws would clench so tightly that the white knuckles would actually show. I would feel a vacuous, empty hollow developing in the pit of my belly, as I perceived I was missing out on so much, not enjoying the benefits of an extended family. I knew that it would just be me and my mother for Thanksgiving and Christmas, as it was predictably every year. Our delightful cottage had once belonged to a Scottish couple who emigrated to America in the late 60s and missed their homeland so very much that they recreated the Scottish Highlands cottage that they had once owned in our small Nebraska town, using exactly the same building materials that you would use in Scotland and hiring a Scottish architect and builder. So it had that whimsical, enchanted country feel about it that invited a plethora of compliments, and perfect strangers would knock on our front door, asking us if we would consider selling them our place. "Your cottage is so dreamy," they'd say. "We'd love to buy this place from you. We'll pay over and above its worth." But my mother would never be persuaded to part with a home that she had grown to love like a child. The kitchen overlooked very pleasing views of the front yard and the street beyond, where you could see the long ribbon of grey asphalt and the tightly clustered houses on the other side of the street, staring back at you, all boasting small front and back yards. The street was lined by tall American linden trees that boasted fragrant yellow flowers in spring that attracted all manner of bees and butterflies. I could see the postman this morning through the kitchen window. He had his postal bag flung over his blue shirt. He trotted up to our front door. Ruggs immediately abandoned his placement over my feet. His ears perked up. I watched amused as he boisterously bounded over to the door. A low bark emanated from the back of his throat, as the splattering of post was pushed through the letterbox and with a loud clattering thump landed in a small heap on the flagstone floor of our entrance hall. Ruggs came trotting back into the kitchen with a mouthful of post, which he obediently plopped on my mother's lap. I hasten to say I taught him that trick myself. As an only child, you have lots of time on your hands to engage in all kinds of tricks, to while away the long lonely hours, and keep yourself entertained. "Thank you, Ruggs," said my mother, patting his soft coat, as she glanced at the letters on her lap. She sifted through the post, and when she came upon a letter with exquisite black curly writing on it, done in a black fountain pen, she visibly paled, staring at the writing as if she'd seen a ghost. She twiddled the manila envelope in her hands, spinning it around and around in her fingers. Then finally she dropped the letter onto the breakfast nook table and began pacing up and down the kitchen awkwardly, constantly glancing back at the letter, almost as if she was afraid it might suddenly grow legs and jump off the table to bite her. I don't think she realized I was watching her, with a bewildered, nonplussed expression on my face. What was going on with my mother? She was behaving like those punishing scenes on a movie, when someone's been taken into surgery after a deadly car accident. The family members are so desperately nervous. They pace up and down the cold, hard linoleum floors of the hospital corridors, waiting to hear from a surgeon, their hearts begging for good news. The only other time I've ever seen such idiosyncratic behaviour before is with animals in zoo enclosures who are so incredibly bored they walk around and around and around. In my mother's case she was certainly not bored, but she'd had a dreadful shock of some kind. She certainly knew who had written her that letter. She recognised the distinctive handwriting. She was afraid to open the envelope, but the thought-provoking question that charged me with an insatiable curiosity was why? Who had written to her? What was she hiding? What was this all about? I grabbed the manila envelope to examine the exquisite handwriting. As far as I knew, people didn't write like this anymore. My mother barked, "Don't touch that!" I dropped the letter onto the breakfast table, in surprise. I swear my mother had just growled at me. "Why aren't you reading it?" I challenged her, cocking my head to one side. "You know who this is from, don't you?" I grinned. "It's not an old boyfriend from your past getting in touch with you after all these years, who heard you divorced and is hoping to get reacquainted?" I asked. My mother's face went crimson, and for a brief moment I thought I'd hit the nail on the head. She waved her arms in the air dismissively. "Don't be ridiculous, Joe. This is not from an old boyfriend of mine. I can assure you of that." "But then who's it from?" I asked inquiringly. "Why won't you open it? You're acting really weird, Mother." I retrieved the letter again, waved it around at her provocatively. My mother was not amused. She barked again. "Would you please put down that letter, Joe? For God's sake, put it down. That's my letter, and I would appreciate it if you didn't touch it." I discerned that my mother was becoming belligerent. I obliged her capricious demands. Her whole body jiggled and trembled with indignation. She moved stealthily towards the letter, as if approaching a deadly snake that she was petrified was going to suddenly lash out at her and bite her with its forked tongue. She sat down on the built-in bench of the breakfast nook. I watched her opening the letter hesitantly with her ivory letter-opener. All the while her fingers trembled violently. Even when she had completed the task at hand, she seemed reluctant to pull out the letter from the sleeve of the envelope, as if she was terribly afraid of what it might contain. My mind was a whirl of questions, but I restrained myself from asking her who the letter was from. I stared at her with bated breath, my fists clenched tightly under the table, for I was sensitive to my mother's apprehension. If anything troubled her, it also troubled me. I didn't like my mother to be this distressed, and at 15 years old I still considered myself the man of the house. It was my job to protect my mother. But why was she behaving so outlandishly? How could a mere letter cause someone to become so discomposed? People trembled when they went to the dentist or received their results from an examination. But trembling over a simple letter with a Montana postcode that looked so innocent, Well, it didn't make any sense at all.
Go on, I said encouragingly. Open it, Mum. If you don't open it, you'll be wondering what it says. And that'll be all the more frustrating for you, I reasoned with her. On sober reflection, I think my encouraging words were the quintessential nudge my mother actually needed. Of course, you're right, Joel. I don't think I have a choice in the matter, do I? I have to open it. She released a huge, wary sigh, and then twitching nervously, she pulled out the letter from the manila envelope. I could see the letter was written on crisp, expensive, high-quality writing paper with a watermark on it. I observed the very neat, sweeping long lines of perfect curly writing, and wondered secretly who in this day and age really wrote like this, with an enviable scroll, who made the words look like pure art, the kind of writing you would happily frame and put up in your toilet cubicle, a novel piece of art. I watched my mother reading the letter, and it was not long before her eyes misted over with tears. I passed her a tissue. She blew into it hard with a trumpeting sound. She folded the letter up, placing it back into the envelope, and got up. I could see she was shaking erratically as she tried to steady herself. She rested her quavering arm on the kitchen counter, waywardly pressing the button of the opaque kettle down. It lit up with a blue light and began to steadily boil away. My mother lightheadedly made herself another coffee. She had already drunk 2 mugs of coffee this morning, but I suspected the act of making the coffee, the ritual of putting coffee, sugar and cream together in a mug, and pouring the hot water over the top, while she stirred it together with a teaspoon, in some bizarre way, offered her a brief measure of comfort. She walked over to the breakfast nook and slunk into the seat opposite me, while my eyes focused intently on her, my heart hoping she'd tell me what the hell was going on. But I didn't want to push my mother, as I knew if she felt cornered like an animal, I'd get nothing out of her. My mother held the coffee cup tightly in one hand, while her fingers caressed the trunk on the other side, almost as if she was stroking a cat, to bring her a sense of calm in the chaotic upheaval of her thoughts that were clearly darting around the place like fireflies around an outside lamp. My mother's eyes bashfully washed over the breakfast nook, as if she suddenly found the table's surface very interesting, but I knew she was avoiding any eye contact with me, as if in some way what she was about to tell me concerned me. "Joe, I've got something I need to tell you." I didn't like the sound of this. I immediately stiffened. My slumped back straightened out, my jaw clenched tightly, my cheeks flushed as red as a field of poppies, and a very uneasy feeling overcame me. What the hell was my mother going to tell me? I had a sense that whatever it was, I was not going to like it. "I gathered that," I said obsequiously. "Who is the letter from?" "It's from your grandfather," I gasped, cupping my hands around my mouth in astonishment, staring at my mother with wide, bewildered eyes, as I tried to assimilate the gravity of what she was telling me. "You mean your father?" She nodded. "But I don't understand. I thought you said he was dead. He died in a plane crash with my grandmother. That's what you told me." My mother shrugged her shoulders. "I said that because they were dead to me. But if you must know, your grandparents are very much alive and very well. They're asking all about you. They'd like very much to meet you." It was hard for me to get my head around what my mother was telling me. My grandparents were alive, and all this time my mother had pretended they didn't even exist anymore. Why would she do such a nonsensical thing? "But, Mum," I stammered, "why did you lie to me? Why did you pretend they were dead? I just don't get it." My mother sighed. "I suppose I better tell you the truth. I owe you that." "Like hell you do," I said, unable to help myself from feeling exceedingly annoyed with my mother for having kept a secret from me for so long. My mother's story. I grew up in Montana. My parents lived on a beautiful tree farm. We also had apple orchards. I had an enviable childhood, as we owned 6 black and bay American quarter horses. When I returned home from school every day, I'd take my horse out of our gate, trotting down some equestrian trails through the woods and across the alpine meadows. It was a liberating feeling, a feeling of being unshackled. I felt so connected to the natural world, so alive, so vibrant.
I also had a plethora of friends in town, namely children like myself, whom attended the local school with me. Regretfully, I've long since lost touch with them over the years. My parents were lovingly devoted to me. I can't complain about that. I certainly had a very happy childhood. One day I returned home from one of my horse rides to find a 5-year-old boy in my parents' charge. He was a cute little thing, with a cherub-like face, winsome little dimples on either side of his cheeks, and a sweep of curly brown hair. He had the biggest blue eyes I've ever seen, framed by thick dark lashes. Let's just say he was a kind of child you fall in love with at once. His name was Edward, and was my mother's younger sister's child. My mother's younger sister Chloe was a rebel, always getting into heaps of trouble. She was a carefree type of girl, who never took responsibility for anything. It would seem that she was going through all kinds of personal issues in her life, which my mother never elaborated on at the time, but I guessed that they were drug-related. It was clear she didn't want to look after little Edward. At the time I had no idea I had a little cousin, so when I first met Edward, I was thrilled to be acquainted with him. My Aunt Chloe had no idea who Edward's real father was, for she had warmed up far too many strangers' beds over the years, and most of those men she had met were like passing ships in the night, there one night, gone the next, and she'd never see them again. It was decided that my parents would become Edward's legal guardians, and his natural mother was happily to relinquish her responsibilities of caring for her child. So he became my little brother. In fact, I never considered him a cousin in that regard. Edward was such a delightful little boy, and my parents fell under his beguiling spell, hook, line, and sinker, and so did I. We adored that child. I think at some point both my parents actually believed that they had physically birthed Edward themselves. It was like they clean forgot that he was Chloe's child. As far as they were concerned, he was their little boy, as in the same way I regarded him as a brother. He was such a curious, inquisitive child, fascinated about everything, with a spirited, zestful enthusiasm that was infectious. My grandfather taught him to play the flute, and growing up I'd hear the flute playing in the background all day. It was such a soothing sound, and Edward was a natural, who claimed that one day he wanted to become a musician. It was enigmatic that someone in our family line was this musical. We perceived that this gene must have come from his father's bloodline, but as to who his father was, we would never know. As his older, wiser, devoted and adoring sister, I was expected to watch over him when my parents were otherwise busily engaged. I delighted in that responsibility, for I thoroughly enjoyed hanging out with my little brother. One day when Edward was 10 years old, and I was 20, we both got onto our bicycles and rode down the country lanes together, which was something we enjoyed doing regularly. It was a prepossessing, idyllic day. It was spring, as all the dogwoods and cherry blossoms were in blossom. The sky was a cup of blue, the air fresh and invigorating, where a gentle breeze was blowing against our faces and whipping against our clothes. The road was white and sandy, sprinkled with tiny pebbles that beat against our bicycle wheels. We were riding past meadows, lofty trees, and then down one of those horse-riding trails into the woods towards the stream. We disembarked from our bicycles, which we balanced precariously against a couple of old, rather gnarled-looking oak trees, and eagerly skipped towards the stream. I loved this little spot, as there were luxurious-looking weeping willows that skimmed their long, sweeping leaves over the silvery water. The stream chugged merrily over the sculptural rocks. We giggled like a couple of naughty schoolkids, and haphazardly threw our socks and shoes over the pebbly beach. We went enthusiastically paddling in the water, looking at the fish that bounded past us. The water was icy cold, with a temperature of only above 40 degrees, but we didn't care, even though our feet had grown blue from the cold. We were having the whale of a time, running around in the water, and occasionally splashing at each other with jubilant kicks.
"Look, Sylvia, look!" cried Edward. "Did you see that fish over there? It was so big! It was so big!"
he said, his eyes brightening. He kept lunging into the water with his tiny hands, trying to grab at the fishes that passed us by. But he did not manage to catch anything, and his face looked rather disappointed.
"You won't catch them like that, silly," I laughed. "They're far too quick for you. You'll have to get Daddy to teach you how to fish like he taught you to play the flute. My guess is you'll be a great fisherman one day." My brother looked appalled. He squinted at me through his blue eyes. "But why would I want to do that? If I catch the fish, then we'll hit it on the head, fillet it and eat it. I don't want to hurt any of the fish. I want to catch them and then let them go so that they're free."
I smiled. Edward was like that. He loved animals of every kind. He had saved little fledglings that fell from their nests and allowed them to recover until one day they were fully grown and could fly away. He even saved a bee once that was suffering from low blood sugar. Edward gave the bee honey, and it soon recovered. That was who he was. He was always catching butterflies that were perching on his hand, and he'd watch them fly away. We were merrily splashing around in the water with our feet when we saw her. I remember being completely gobsmacked and overawed by her. She was ambling casually towards the water, swinging her arms. At first she didn't see us, and then she saw Edward, and when she did, her gleeful brown eyes brightened up like a kid who's been given a toy train at Christmas that he's dreaming about. It was a lively look. I had no idea what she was. She was about 8 foot tall, 600 pounds, and covered in long flowing dark hair. It was a chestnutty colour. I remember she was intimidating both in size and girth, but her face was incredibly human. I did not react with fear as you might have expected I would. I felt almost as if I was sitting behind a television set at home, watching an outlandish movie, with a bowl of popcorn in my hand. I felt disconnected to this moment, as if in some way it was all but an illusory dream, that I would surely awaken from in any moment. I expect that that's how you try to make sense of something that does not fit in with your paradigm of the world. When the creature saw Edward, it was like she was completely beguiled by him. She paddled over to him in the water, cradling him lovingly in her arms. Edward stared at her in surprise, while the creature bent down on her haunches and stroked his hair, looking lovingly into his eyes. She was chattering away happily to him in a foreign dialect, and he was nodding and smiling, as if he understood every word of what she was saying. Edward seemed to not mind the attention she was lavishing on him. On the contrary, he seemed to be thoroughly enjoying himself, and was chuckling and smiling. He had warmed to this ambiguous creature, that gave off a youthful energy, that made me believe that she was a youngling, possibly about 13 years old in human age, even though she was tall. I can't be sure of that, of course, but that was the impression I got. I think she was so enchanted and taken by Edward. She put him gently on her shoulders and was about to dash away with him, when another one of these strange creatures emerged from the woodgrove. I got the impression that this creature was the smaller creature's mother. She'd been watching her daughter from the woodgrove, as if she suspected her mischievous daughter was misbehaving herself and was not up to any good. She had a responsible, more mature, level-headed, prudent maternal energy. She was 9 foot tall, and was not amused with what was unfolding before her. She was chastising the creature in a strange language, throwing her arm around in exasperated frustration, and pointing to my little brother, who really seemed totally unconcerned about being on the younger creature's shoulders.
"Ikata, umbukotati, hatanakwa, hopolanatili, akitobo."
The larger creature reminded me of a disgruntled mother, who was trying desperately to reprimand her child for insolent, insubordinate behaviour. I sensed that her mulishly stubborn daughter had given her more than enough grief over the years. I perceived she was telling her daughter to leave the boy alone. "He's not yours! Put him down!" But the daughter was holding on to my brother, becoming very possessive towards him, like a belligerent little girl might be over her dollies. She held on to my brother tightly, hanging on to him for dear life, as if Edward now belonged to her and was hers to keep. She wasn't going to allow her mother to take him from her. She started to try and run away from her mother, with my brother on her shoulders, but the larger creature leapt forward into the water to stop her by barricading her path. She forcefully yanked her arm, so hard as if to say, "No, no, you don't do that! You're going to let that boy go now, do you understand?" The creature carrying my brother was jerked forward. She lost her balance. My brother went flying off her shoulders,
and his little head hit a large, jagged sculptural rock jutting out of the water precariously. Both the bemused creatures stared down in horror as they saw the rushing water turn crimson. The larger creature got down on her hands and knees and fished my brother out of the water, clutching him in her arms. He looked like a limp, lifeless doll. His blue eyes stared vacantly into space, like the eyes of a dead fish. The creatures were clearly devastated. The mother tried to revive little Edward, but they could both see he was dead. The mother was pointing her fingers accusingly at her daughter, who became bashfully sheepish and was cocking her head in shame. I knew she was saying, "Look what you've done!" They began to argue between themselves, talking backwards and forwards together. "Itata o mutalakina tua hasakatanala to habakatatwina ikilika ampola ikino apo tatalaki hoponaswa." I could see they were distraught. My brother was dead. The larger creature was slapping his face as if trying to revive him, but it was no use. In that moment I snapped out of my dreamlike state and hurriedly ran over to my brother. The creatures watched me as I tried desperately to wake him up, but it was too late. He was dead. They were shaking their heads lugubriously. The kind, benevolent mother tapped me on the back. I turned around to look at her directly in the eyes. I remember she had treacle-colour eyes that were so full of love. She spoke to me in a strange language and said, "Iki tuana akola na tua, hisafakala na tua." "I'm so sorry. It was an accident. That daughter of mine wanted to keep the boy. She wants a baby of her own, you see. But I told her this boy has his own mother. Ikantua hafukulamukwa, iganaswa, shikilina katawana, himola tuana kina." I shouldn't have yanked her arm so hard. "I'm so sorry. You'll need to go and find your mother to tell her what happened." I was amazed because I understood everything she was telling me. Her words were translated into my head in English. Needless to say, when my parents discovered that Edward was dead, they blamed me for his demise. As I was supposed to be watching over him, I had betrayed their trust.
"I'm very, very disappointed with you, Sylvia. You should have been looking after Edward properly. He's only 10 years old, for goodness sake."
I told my parents exactly what had happened. My mother was furious with me.
"You expect us to believe this drivel? That some ponderous creature with a human face dropped Edward, who accidentally hit a rock in the water? You know what that's called, Sylvia? It's called passing the buck on to someone else, making up an outlandish excuse so you can shirk your responsibility. You know you should have been watching over Edward. This is entirely your fault, Sylvia. I hold you entirely responsible for what happened to your brother. You're trying to make some fictitious creature up, something from your own imagination, so you don't have to be accountable for what happened. You realise how cuckoo you sound? And more to the point, me and your father don't believe a word of it, nor will anyone else for that matter."
"It was an accident, Mum, I promise you," I insisted. "The smaller creature wanted to keep Edward, but the bigger creature was trying to get her to let Edward go. So she knew her daughter had no right to keep Edward, as Edward wasn't her child. Edward fell out of her arms from 8 feet off the ground, hitting his head on this jagged rock in the water. It was a fatal blow. He was gone so fast, he wouldn't have felt a thing. I'm really sorry, Mum. I really am," I said, my eyes filling with tears. My mother became more belligerent.
"And that's supposed to make me feel better, is it? Our son is dead thanks to your outrageous incompetence. We trusted you, Sylvia, to take care of him. You're 20 years old, for God's sake." "Listen to yourself, Sylvia, spouting out this stuff and nonsense that you expect us to believe, these ridiculous claims of yours. I'd prefer it if you took ownership for what happened, if you admitted the truth, and actually said, 'Sorry, Mum, Edward tripped in the water, knocked his head against a rock.' The truth would have been a lot more digestible than listening to you create such spurious stories like this. I just can't believe you. I can't believe that you would be so irresponsible." "But, Mum, I'm not lying. I'm telling you the truth." "Your mother's right, Sylvia. You must stop prattling on and on like this. You sound ludicrous. You know you're responsible for not taking care of Edward. He's now dead, thanks to you. Now would you kindly go to bed? I can't look at you now. I am so disappointed in you, Sylvia.
In truth, what happened over that devastatingly crushing period of my young life is all but an unwelcome, indistinct, hazy blur, that when I look back, it's like seeing things through a dark veil, as everything you don't want to remember can occupy the areas of your brain where your recollections can be buried under piles of cobwebs and dust, like the boxes long since forgotten in your attic. You can do that with the blistering memories of your past that can haunt your darkest nightmares. What I do remember, with a vivid regret, is that both of my parents could not bear to look at me. They were grieving Edward's tragic passing, but clearly blamed me for what had happened. Furthermore, they were even more incensed by my far-fetched, implausible claims, forbidding me to talk about them to anyone, lest people should think I needed sectioning. My parents failed to look at me during our family meals. My mother wouldn't engage in any conversations with me, willfully ignoring me, almost as if I was an ugly blot on the landscape that she'd like to pretend never existed. I knew they blamed me for Edward's death, vehemently believing that I was responsible for what had happened, and that it could so easily have been avoided if I'd only been paying attention. They were wrong about that. I could not bear the oppression, it was suffocating, of living under the same roof with them, when their love for me had dwindled and turned as sour as rancid milk. I remember overhearing my mother saying to my father, "You know what I wish, Curtis, is that our daughter actually had the decency to own up to what happened, instead of making up these nebulously sketchy stories. I feel as if I don't know her anymore. It's like when Edward died, so did our daughter. When I look at her, I feel so much hate. I know it's incongruous and irrational to feel like that towards your own daughter. It's also terribly, terribly unkind. But little Edward would be alive if our daughter had bothered to pay attention. And how can I ever forgive her for being so dreadfully irresponsible?"
I feel much the same way, sweetheart. I can't look at our daughter in the eyes any more. I'm so livid.
I was riddled with feelings of guilt and shame, and beyond anything else I was grieving Edward's fortuitous loss, but my parents had no empathy towards me in this regard. At the time I was dating your father, and on seeing how grievously upset I was over what had transpired with little Edward, he actively encouraged me to move in with him to his parents' home.
Move in with me, Sylvia. You know it's a good idea. My parents will not mind at all. On the contrary, they love you like family. They'll be delighted if you move in. You can't continue to live in a toxically condemning environment like this, where your blind-sighted parents have shackled you to the blame for your brother's death. It's ridiculous, and it's not healthy. The guilt they will inflict on you will eat you alive, and no one deserves that.
"And you? Do you believe my story, Ralph?" I asked him, "about the strange creatures I encountered at the stream? Because I promise you it's true. I'm not making any of it up."
Whether I believe you or not, Sylvia, is neither here nor there, and it doesn't matter. And even if you did make those creatures up, your parents should be ashamed for treating you with such obvious disdain. You're their child, for God's sake. Have they not heard of unconditional love before? They've lost one child. Now they're pushing you away. They're well on their way to losing another child. And they have clearly not considered the ramifications of what they are doing.
"They'll be glad if I go," I said, the tears pouring down my cheeks, which Ralph lovingly wiped away with his hanky.
"Listen to me," he said kindly. "Everything is going to be fine. We're going to your parents' house. You'll pack your clothes up in a suitcase. You will tell them you're going for good, that you are moving in with me." And that is ultimately what happened. I remember good old Ralph gave my parents a piece of his mind. "I'm bloody glad I don't have parents like you," The two of you should be ashamed of yourself," he exclaimed, giving them dagger-like looks. "You don't have a monopoly on grief, you know. Surprise, surprise, your daughter is grieving too. She loved Edward with all her heart, but you've conveniently forgotten about that. All the two of you care about is wallowing in your self-indulgent pity. You both deserve each other. I hope you thoroughly enjoy your lonely, miserable, isolated existence. I'm here to pick up Sylvia's clothes for her. She's moving in with me and my parents, who will treat her like a human being, not a dog who fouled up the yard or tore the settee to shreds. Edward's death was not Sylvia's fault. Get over it. You're just looking for someone to blame," he growled. My cantankerous father became furious. He gave Ralph a contemptuous look. "Get out of this house now," he barked. "Forget about Sylvia's clothes. She's not getting anything. Nor are you welcome to cross the threshold of my home again. And by the way, you are welcome to my daughter. She's caused enough chaos around here already. We're glad to be rid of her, and we never want to see her ever again." "Don't worry," said Ralph. "Sylvia and I are going. We can buy her a brand new wardrobe. That's not a problem. But the trouble is you can't get new parents. But she's got my parents who will love her in your place." I loved the way your father stuck up for me, and it was his determination to take care of me that made me fall in love with him. It was for that reason I married him, not realizing that further down the line we would grow apart. I will never forget his loyalty to me, though. I gave birth to you, and have not been in touch with my parents since then. And when I went off with your father that day, they didn't give a toss. It was like they were so glad to finally be rid of me. It was from that moment on I decided that they were dead to me. When my mother told me her incredulous story, I was completely dumbfounded and disgusted with my grandparents for treating her so badly. "Did you make the story up, though, about the creatures at the stream?" I asked her, "so that they wouldn't blame you for what happened?" "Goodness gracious me, no. My story is absolutely true. What I said happened did happen. The trouble is, my parents just would not believe me. I was to soon learn the creatures I saw were Bigfoots. I think the young one had a maternal instinct and fancied a baby of her own. I think she wanted to snatch Edward away to raise as her own baby, like a kid does with a doll. Her mother intervened to try and stop her, and when she grabbed her daughter's arm rather roughly, Edward just fell off her shoulders into the water from 8 feet off the ground and slammed into a rock. It was an unfortunate accident, but they never meant it to happen." "A Bigfoot?" I gasped. "You saw 2 Bigfoot? Are you being deadly serious? This is not a joke, is it?" "That's what I assume they were," said my mother, "based on the research I've done since then. Their emotions were so human, you know. They were devastated about the accident, so genuinely, and the large female apologized to me profusely about what had happened. Neither of them meant this to occur." "And your parents? What did they write to you in that letter just now?" My mother pulled out the letter from the manila envelope and read it to me. "My darling Sylvia, it is with a great deal of reluctance that I write this letter, for I am terribly afraid of how it might be received. For I would not blame you if you tore it up into shreds or burnt it up. It's been over 15 long years, and we have not heard a word from you since Edward's tragic passing. It has been very lonely without you in our lives, and we have missed you desperately. I hope you have it in your heart to forgive us for what happened all those years ago. I wouldn't blame you if you can't forgive us. You are our daughter. We love you with all of our hearts. I'm ashamed for how we treated you back then, blaming you very unfairly for Edward's fortuitous death, which I emphatically now believe was an accident. Losing Edward was a devastating blow to our lives, but we selfishly failed to consider that you too were also grieving the loss of your beloved brother, stroke cousin. We made his death all about us, and excluded you from the fray. We were looking for someone to blame for what had happened to Edward. It was easy to pin the blame on you. You were 20 years old at the time, and abandoned much of your social life in order to take care of little Edward. But we never considered that for a moment. We never appreciated the sacrifices you made on his behalf, as you loved little Edward as much as we did. I remember the day you left home for good to be with your boyfriend Ralph Finchley. I acted like a bear with a sore head. In truth, I must confess, I was devastated to see you go. A very broken man I was, but far too proud to admit as much, and so was your mother. I was to learn you got married, and later had a baby, and that we now have a grandchild, a boy. I would like to press upon you that even if you yourself never want to see us again, we would be so delighted to make our grandson's acquaintance. I imagine he must be about 15 years old now, or maybe 14, but we'd love to mend our bridges with you, Sylvia. But if you cannot find it in your heart to forgive us, please, I beg you, don't withhold our grandson from us. He is so welcome to visit us at any time he wishes. Stay with us for 3 weeks or so. We'd love to get to know him better. Once again, I am so sorry for what happened, and I ask you to forgive us. Your mother sends you her fondest love and deepest regrets. We miss you so dreadfully, and love you with all our hearts. Love, Dad.
I stared at my mother in confounded disbelief as she read the letter to me.
Your dad is sorry, isn't he, Mum? He's reaching out to you after all this time. It couldn't have been easy for him to put that letter together. He treated you unkindly, and he admits that, and he regrets it. Are you going to forgive him? I know it can't be easy for you.
I forgave my parents a long time ago, but I shan't forget how they treated me. That I simply can't do. More to the point, how do you feel about going to stay with your grandparents for a while? It's not a bad idea for you to meet them.
I'm not sure. I don't like the way they treated you, even though they're sorry. How can I stay with people who made you feel so bad?
Look, they were grieving at the time. Don't be so hard on them. They said things they probably regret. I promise you they're good people, with their hearts in the right place.
But they didn't believe your account of what happened to Edward. That would be upsetting for me if you didn't believe me about something.
My mother shrugged her shoulders. Who can blame them for doubting my story? Think about it. If you told me there was a fairy flying around our kitchen, would you expect me to believe you?
But this is different. Fairies aren't real, are they? And even a cynic has to admit that there is a distinct possibility that Bigfoot might actually exist.
Some people believe in fairies, my mother pointed out. In Ireland there are countless legends of the fae, people who claim to have had encounters with little people. At the time I expected my parents to believe me, but I should have judiciously kept my mouth shut. I could see the disappointment, the contempt, the pity, the disgust in my parents' eyes. They couldn't believe I had the blatant audacity and the impertinence to make up such an unlikely story. In truth, I should have told them what they wanted to hear, that Edward's death was a grievous accident, that he tripped, stumbling from a tree branch that overlooked the water, onto a rock, hitting his head. You see, the coroner discerned he'd fallen from a height, onto a hard surface, cracking his skull. They'd be more inclined to believe that story than my seemingly spurious, erroneous account. People believe what they want to believe, as sometimes the truth is incredibly uncomfortable to digest or to even wear, like a tight pair of jeans that just don't fit well. I think my outrageous claims only fueled their anger further, as they thought I didn't want to take responsibility for Edward's death. They'd have liked me to have said, "I'm sorry, Mum. I'm sorry, Dad. It was all my fault. I'm to blame for what happened. I wasn't watching Edward closely enough." I think if I'd done that, the rift between us might not have been so stormy. They might have been more inclined to comfort me, but instead my words ruffled their feathers and set the cat among the pigeons.
Well, I think they should have known you better, shouldn't they? I mean, you didn't lie a lot when you were little, did you?
Oh, no, I was honest to a fault. That was part of my problem.
Well, there you are then. Why were they so quick to doubt you? That's all I'm saying.
And what I'm saying, son, is that I think you should meet your grandparents. You are their grandson, after all. I think it would be very nice if you went to visit them. If you're not happy, you can leave at once. Call a taxi. I'll give you some money so that you don't have to feel trapped, against your will, staying there, I mean. But I think you'll like them. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised how very nice they actually are.
But why should I visit them?
Because they're your grandparents, of course. Don't make this about me. Give them a chance, will you? They'd love to get to know you. And despite everything, as I keep telling you, they're good people.
And you're not going to see them yourself?
I asked. I can't, said my mother. The wound is too deep. But you can tell them I forgive them. 3 months later, my grandparents had sent a taxi on my behalf to pick me up from my home in Nebraska and to take the 13-hour trip to Montana. The taxi was picking me up at 5 in the morning, and if all being well, I might arrive at their farmhouse between 6, 7, or even 8 in the evening, depending on how good the traffic was, and of course taking in account the stops along the way. My mother stood in the driveway, wiping tears from her eyes, as the taxi driver loaded my suitcase into the back of his trunk. "Bye, sweetheart," said my mother, giving me an affectionate hug. "I'm so glad you're doing this. I think it's so important you get to know your grandparents. I really do. They're desperately excited to meet you. I know they are." I kissed my mother goodbye and reluctantly walked over to the taxi, climbing into the back and sinking into the seat. It had taken much persuasion on my mother's part to convince me to go and stay with my grandparents. I told myself I was doing it for her, which was why I eventually relented. The truth was, with no close family around me, the idea of meeting my grandparents on my mother's side of the family excited me. I was angry, of course, with their treatment of my mother, but I was appeased by their letter of apology that they had sent her. It had made them appear all the more human, vulnerable to making mistakes like the rest of us do. In my humble opinion, I also had to remind myself that hurting people hurt people. One of our teachers at school taught us that lesson. At the time, the school was dealing with a bullying problem. She explained the frail complexities of the human condition and how we respond and react when we're hurting. It would seem the way my grandparents reacted to their son's death was quite understandable, but their brusque treatment of my mother was both unkind and cruel. I had decided that I would give my grandparents a fighting chance, but if they said one bad word about my mother, I would take the next taxi home. I was nervous about meeting them, of course I was, but I tried not to think about it as I sat in the back of the taxi with my earphones on. I could see the chatty, very talkative Bangladesh taxi driver, who talked in pidgin English, glancing at me through his curious brown, bird-like eyes through the visor mirror, in the hope that the two of us would soon engage in a hearty conversation. Granted, he was nice and convivial enough, but I didn't want to talk, so I shut him off by listening to music. It was getting cramped in the back of the taxi, sitting in one position for hours on end, and even though we made a few stops along the way, I couldn't wait to stretch my legs again. At 15, I was already just under 6 foot tall, with gangly long legs like my father, and was becoming restlessly uncomfortable. Later in the early evening, I glanced out of the passenger side window, smudging my nose against the pane, as I tried to discern my environment that was cloaked in obscurity. Instead, I was met by the ambiguous shadows of tall, lofty trees, rambling meadows, rugged embankments, all swathed in a tenebrific, misty veil that swallowed up the definitive features and details of the landscape. In truth, everything looked like black, dense cardboard cutouts set against a coffee-coloured backwash. It was difficult to make anything out at all. There were no street lights in this rural part of the world, and farmhouses were few and far between, set wide apart, their bright lights glowing like blazing headlights intrusively through the looming shadows. I was told that we would be there soon. Brace yourself, I was told. The roads around here would be bumpy. Of course, the taxi driver wasn't wrong about that. The taxi trundled down rocky roads,
its tyres bouncing up and down the uneven cracks, bumps and potholes, until finally we came to an open iron gate. There was a signpost attached to the wooden railing, which read Rosewood Ramble. I knew I was now moments away from meeting my grandparents, and there were butterflies flapping away furiously in my belly. My hands began to twitch nervously, and beads of perspiration anointed my upper lip. While I wanted to stretch my legs more than anything in the world, another part of me was desirous to tap the taxi driver on the back and tell him I'd changed my mind and to please hurry back home to Nebraska. I felt as if there was a frog in the back of my throat as we neared our approach to the farmhouse where my mother had grown up as a young girl. So this was it. I saw my grandparents standing expectantly on the wrap-around porch that hugged the entrance of their large, symmetrical, double-story farmhouse. I couldn't see them clearly. The moonlight was so faint, the stars reticent. My grandparents just looked like two stoic silhouettes standing there with their bright eyes pinned on the taxi. I suddenly felt very self-conscious as I hesitantly opened the door when the taxi came to a grinding halt, and a plump woman wearing a floral skirt and white blouse came bounding towards me with her arms outstretched and her voice rapturously animated.
"Oh my word! Oh my word! We finally meet our grandson! Oh, I can't believe it! You must be Joe!" she said, hugging me tightly. "It's so good to meet you finally! You have no idea how much I've longed for this moment. My word, you're so tall! Oh, it's lovely to see you."
My grandfather attempted to shake my hand, but his wife said,
"Goodness gracious, Curtis, this is your grandson. How about giving him a nice big hug?"
I was rather overawed by the ebullient, enthusiastic welcome I'd received from both of my grandparents. I wasn't used to being the centre of anyone else's world, beyond my mother's. I felt warmly welcomed into their abode as they ushered me indoors. I could hear the taxi drive away as rubber tyres swished against the stones. My grandfather led me up to the sweeping walnut staircase to a bedroom he claimed had belonged to my mother when she was a little girl. He paused uncomfortably in the doorway for a moment.
"This was where your mother's room was when she was a girl. Everything's much the same as she left it, although we've kept it clean over the years and changed the sheets, of course. I thought it would suit you to stay here."
It was strange to be in my mother's bedroom, and it was almost as if I could feel her energy, as there were pop idol posters on the walls, and pictures of my mother as a girl with her friends, displayed in a big collage where the weathered photographs that had been stuck to the cardboard were now peeling away at will. I noticed even my mother's teenage clothes were still on one side of the wardrobe. They smelt of mildew, and some of her woolen sweaters had been ruthlessly devoured by moths, while another side had been cleared of her things to make way for my clothes. 1 week later, it had been quite an adjustment settling into my grandparents' home, but to give them their due, they had made me feel incredibly welcome from the very beginning, and thankfully openly discussed the elephant in the room, my mother, which I was glad about, for it relieved any awkwardness between us. My grandfather looked pained when he lit his pipe and inhaled the aromatic tobacco, which he puffed out in a pillar of white smoke. I knew he was smoking his pipe to obviously allay his nerves. My grandfather was 6 foot tall, but I think he'd shrunk over the years, unless my mother exaggerated his height, which I highly doubt. His body was thin and lanky, although he had a little girth hanging over his belt. His hands, knobbly and arthritic, were weathered by time, and his skin had not escaped the damaging effects of hours spent out in the Montana sunshine, for it was heavily wrinkled, but his bright blue eyes peered at me sorrowfully from behind hooded lids, revealing a deep regret and sober reflection.
"Has your mother told you why we all fell out? It was most unfortunate. If I could go back in time, I would do things very differently. Oh, for the benefit of hindsight, there is so much I regret. Mum told me about Edward's death. It was a very sad story," I said. "I know. It was a dreadful time for all of us, I'm afraid. I can't express what a dreadful time it was for all of us. We did not take the news well. I'm afraid we were most unkind, grievously unfair to your mother at the time, said some thorny, barbed things that we both regret. My teacher says it's because hurt people hurt people. That's why you reacted the way you did. I couldn't have put it better myself, son. I think that's exactly what happened. Don't you, dear?" he said, looking at his wife tenderly. My grandmother Ella nodded. She was a plump woman, and this helped her look younger for her years, as her well-upholstered face had kept the wrinkles at bay. She had brown, bear-like eyes and a gentle mother-duck-like energy. "It's true," said my grandmother, letting out a huge sigh. That revealed to me just how much she really did regret their treatment of my mother at the time. They really were incredibly sorry. "I have so many regrets. Oh, I do. I can't even bear to think of the way I treated your mother. I was so outrageously unreasonable. Oh, if I could go back in time, I would do everything so differently. But I can't cry over spilt milk, can I? What's done is done." As time passed, one lazy lackadaisical day stretched out happily into another, and I began to feel quite content living with my grandparents, who began to find a special place in my heart, for it was impossible not to love them, as my mother had claimed they were indeed very good people. "I want to show you something," my grandmother said to me one day, and that was when she led me to a single gravestone, jutting through the long grass, covered with pretty displays of fresh roses. "I come here every day to talk to little Edward. This is his grave. You may not realize this, but your bedroom actually overlooks his burial plot." I stared at the gravestone, feeling a deep sadness descend over me. This child's death had tragically torn a family's life apart. I was sure that little Edward would have hated this to happen, for he was the kind of boy that wanted to throw a fish back into the water. He hated hurting any living thing. He would have despised any family discord. My grandmother's eyes filled with tears, and I reached over to hug her, holding her warmly in my arms. "You're so sweet, Joel. Do you know you really remind me of little Edward? You look just like him in many regards. When I first saw you get out of that taxi when you arrived here, I thought I was seeing double, or a ghost. The likeness between you and Edward is uncanny. It even threw your grandfather when he first laid his eyes on you. You know they say things get easier with the passing of time, but I still feel raw about what happened to poor Edward. And I'm grieved, of course, with my fallout from Sylvia. If you have children one day, Joel, don't allow any petty things to drive a wedge between you and your children. Take it from me, it's not worth it." She leaned down to the gravestone and picked something up in her hand. The only way I can describe it, as like a grass bracelet that had been woven superbly with tiny stitches. My grandmother examined it closely and then handed it to me. "What do you think it is?" she asked me. "I have to tell you that ever since Edward's death 15 years ago, I've been getting these bracelets in spring, usually one a week, and then the rest of the year they just stop like that. Someone is putting them here. It's been an ongoing enigmatic mystery that I've never been able to solve. But there you are, strange things in life can happen. I like to think it's a sign from Edward, telling us he's looking down upon us." "Can I have it?" I asked, admiring the grass bracelet and putting it on my hand for size. It was a perfect fit. "Of course you can have it," said my grandmother. "So you're saying you only receive these grass bracelets during the spring?" "That's right. Isn't it odd?" "It's very interesting. It must mean something. Nothing just happens by chance, you know." I examined the bracelet closely, which I clandestinely believed came from the Bigfoots. Not that I told my grandmother as much. Could one of the Bigfoots that had witnessed Edward's tragic passing be leaving little grass bracelets by the grave during the spring, as their way of remembering the tragedy, in the same way we might lay flowers down at the grave of a loved one? My mother had described the Bigfoots as so human, possessing genuine emotions. Maybe the death of Edward had caused them great distress. Tuesday night, the 16th of May. I went to bed that night, realizing that my spring break holiday with my grandparents was soon coming to an end, and that made me feel very sad. I had telephoned my mother regularly to tell her what a great time I was having with her parents,
and how much they deeply regretted their falling out with her, and wished to make amends. I also told her about the little bracelets I had found at little Edward's gravesite, and how my grandmother claimed that she received these grass bracelets only during the spring. There had been a long pause at the end of the phone, and my mother let out an audible gasp. "Oh, my word! It's got to be the Bigfoots! Those grass bracelets must come from them." "Are you sure?" I asked her.
"Absolutely. There is no doubt about this in my mind. When I encountered those Bigfoots 15 years ago, I have to tell you both of them were wearing about 2 or 3 grass bracelets on their wrists. My guess is they're delivering the bracelets to the grave in spring, as it was a time of year when Edward died. It's possibly their way of remembering him. I told you they were benevolent creatures with very big hearts. The 16th of May, which is this Tuesday, is the anniversary of Edward's death. Maybe the Bigfoots will put a grass bracelet on the gravestone again, on that date. It's just a thought." It would seem that both my grandparents had not forgotten the anniversary of Edward's death, and it was celebrated in the farmhouse with a special tea and dinner. I couldn't help thinking my mother was right. Would the Bigfoots return to leave another bracelet at the gravestone? The idea excited me, as I fancied encountering the idiosyncratic creatures for myself. I promptly decided I'd keep a vigil at the window, which overlooked little Edward's grave. If there was any activity around the gravesite at night, I was sure to see it, I thought. Even though I willed myself to stay awake that night, as I kept walking over to the window and peeking out, hoping I might see 2 ambiguous shadowy creatures creeping towards the grave. But that did not happen, and my eyelids soon grew heavy, not only with disappointment, but tiredness. I tried to fight off the urge to sleep, but I must have lost that battle, as I drifted off. I don't know how long I actually slept for, but I suddenly woke up with a start. I hadn't actually heard anything to grab my attention, but I remembered my vigil, and I was exceedingly annoyed with myself for having failed to remain awake. I certainly wouldn't make a good night watchman, I thought. The Bigfoots must have come and gone already. I cursed myself climbing out of bed, trotting over to the bedroom window, certain that I would not see a thing. It was a magnificently beautiful night, and the whole of my grandparents' front yard was washed in a pearly luminescence, while the silvery stars twinkled brightly. Then I saw 3 ponderous figures moving towards Edward's grave, and I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was seeing the Bigfoots my mother had told me about. But there were 3 of them, not 2, one considerably smaller than the other, that looked to be no more than a child. I had the foresight to go to bed in all my clothes, including my sneakers, for I knew I would need to move fast on my feet, and that is exactly what I did. I literally ran down the staircase, trying to be as discreet as I possibly could. Before I knew it, I was slipping cautiously out of the kitchen door and creeping stealthily along the walls of the house. There was a cool breeze blowing that nipped my neck with an icy chill, as if cold fingers were touching me. The night was filled with the happy trills of crickets and frogs. The outside light on the kitchen door was being serenaded by a plethora of mops that were circling its globe. I was afraid of scaring away the Bigfoots, so I clandestinely bounded very cautiously and very carefully from one tree to another, until I finally found myself behind the old cherry blossom tree that was only a hair's breadth away from the grave. I could see 3 Herculean dark blobs of black, gathered around the gravesite, paying their respects to Edward. They appeared to be chanting something in a strange language that I couldn't understand. I couldn't see them clearly, only their silhouettes, their ponderous large shoulders, their pyramid-shaped heads, their overlong arms. They were so obscure. All of a sudden the little Bigfoot, with his overlong arm, pointed in my direction, and that was when I realized that my presence had been duly noted. One of the Bigfoots, a very large one, began to walk towards me. She was swinging her arms. My mother had told me that the creatures were benign, that I had nothing to fear, but in the looming dark shadows of the dusky twilight that cast everything in a foreboding gloom, this towering, humongous creature moving towards me was more than a little intimidating for my little heart to take, which was thundering against my rib cage, my whole body trembling like a jelly. Suddenly I became so desperately afraid. I so wanted to run away from the cherry blossom tree to the safety of my grandparents' home. I tried to move away, but it was as if I became rooted to the spot, so that I could barely move a single muscle. Then there she was, standing looking at me, her human-like face registering surprised. "Kyukotantui, abakita." "You look so like him," she said to my head. For a moment I was completely bewildered and confounded. Did the Bigfoot actually talk to me? But then I remembered my mother telling me that they had talked to her. I was baffled that anyone could communicate like this so eloquently, but I understood exactly what the creature was saying, as everything was translated into my mind in English. "Sorry, I look like who?" "Tila twana suika." "The boy, of course," she said sorrowfully. "Tuna twa." "The boy that died." "Tila kwala sifokwa, kila noto walakshoanaka." "The boy's grave we're visiting. You must be related to him by blood." "Itwala sikaltakwata, ikam chakalo, o fogobolanisi." I'd like to apologize for what happened. My mother was furious with me. It was all my fault. I wanted him, you see. My mother said he was not mine to keep, but I wouldn't listen. The boy fell out of my arms, well, off my shoulders actually. He hit his head on the rock. I knew I was to blame. It's been hard to forgive myself for what happened. I was always naughty when I was young. My mother knew best, but I never listened. "Ifan tkolo shoka, igali nalakotonopa, isifa kilatwina, isilo no kolamasi." I come here when the trees break out into blossom, to pay my respects every year. "I leave him grass bracelets," she said, pointing to the one I was wearing. "One like that. I came here with my partner to stand over the grave, and with my child. I've seen the boy's spirit around here many times. He's a happy boy. He's at peace, you know. He loves the grass bracelets I leave behind. It's my small way of making amends." "Please don't be sad. Accidents happen. You need to forgive yourself," I told her. "Ikatwana sifo, hokola pasi, ashakana kwalinako, avolopotalinasi." "And to think I thought your kind were not wise. I've forgiven myself, so has the little boy forgiven me. But I shan't forget. It's important to honour the memories of those that have passed to the world of souls. They must always know that they are not forgotten. That's very important, you know." She handed me a grass bracelet. "You keep it this time. The boy wants you to have it. You may not see him, but his spirit is here. He's smiling at you. He's very sad about the disputes in your family, and is begging you to fix them." "I'll be off now," she said. "Godspeed." I watched the Bigfoot gliding back to the gravestone. She chatted to the 2 other Bigfoots, which I knew was her male partner and child. Then I watched them glancing over at me, giving me a nod, and finally gliding away into the woodgrove until they were all but gone. To cut a long story short, in time my mother did forgive her own parents for their brusque treatment of her all those years ago, and she and my grandparents made up for their differences. So we're now one big happy family again. I also took the bull by the horns and invited myself to stay at my father's house, and have now got 3 half-siblings, I'm glad to say. I gave them all a grass bracelet as a gift, which they love, and swear brings them good luck, but I have never told them that those bracelets are made by a Bigfoot. Some things are best kept under cloak and dagger. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Janine and I grew up in the 90s, and when I was about 7 or 8, my parents moved from Atlanta to a very exquisite area in Washington state, in a beautiful spacious doll's house style double-storey home with a grey slate roof, whitewashed walls and square windows, along with a gleaming vintage red front door. Our enchanting postcard perfect home was set against tall hemlocks, grand firs and Douglas fir trees that stood proudly in the firmament like statuesque green giants, and if you glanced through the trees you would see the mountainous valleys beyond, rising up in the distance like masterful blue-grey pyramids. Our property was surrounded by rolling green, perfectly manicured lawns, a small pond, and a scattering of trees and pretty colourful shrubs and garden plants from varying shades of green to deep wines, reds and purples. On the right-hand side of the valley there was a vast wooded area of land that was teeming with indigenous wildlife, like the occasional black bear, mule deer and white-tailed deer, beavers, moles, bobcats, cougars and coyotes, and this area was accessible to most of the people that lived in our neighbourhood and was a wonderful place for us to play as young children growing up. We were incredibly lucky because we could access this wooded area through a gate in our palisade fencing, which means we could literally leave our house and enter the woods immediately. I grew up in a quintessential family home with 2 devoted, fun-loving parents, along with my 2 younger siblings, Lydia and my brother Eddie. My parents were incredibly loving and supportive and encouraged us to be the best that we could be in life. They were both very much in love, and it was exceedingly rare for them to ever fight, and as a result, many people envied my parents' seemingly flawless and perfect marriage. One day something transpired in our home that was so utterly extraordinary that it was literally to shatter the fabric of our world apart and leave an indelible footprint on our childhoods that would never ever quite be the same again. My story begins when I was about 8 years old at the time. I woke up to hear a raucous, monstrous commotion and raised indignant voices of both my parents fighting. I was absolutely startled because I'd never heard them fight before, and those outrageous voices for the first time were very alarming. What was going on with my parents, I wondered. I noticed that both my brother and sister were fast asleep, and I was wondering whether or not to actually wake them. I decided against it, although I was surprised that the loud, disgruntled, angry voices had not aroused them from their slumber. I tiptoed towards the staircase where the white wooden railings overlooked the downstairs living area, where my parents were brawling. I have absolutely no memory of what they were actually fighting about, but they were lashing out at each other like 2 seething, aggressive, rabid dogs that wanted to tear each other apart, limb from limb. I'd never ever seen them this crazed and perturbed before. It was not a physical altercation by any manner of means, but the waspish, stinging words that they were shouting at each other seemed as harmful and deadly as any sharpened bow through my childlike eyes. I was very apprehensive and incredibly alarmed of what I was actually witnessing, as I've never seen my parents exercise such hostility towards each other before. My mother looked so enraged and so hot-tempered that her nose was flaring and her face had grown bright purple, and I remember she threw a vase of flowers at a mirror, smashing it into thousands of pieces, and the shards of glass were everywhere, and the broken vase was fragmented into so many pieces that was lying precariously over the living room floor. Then she picked up several glass goblets and threw them one at a time at the wall in an act of incandescent rage, the likes of such as I've never seen before. My father looked horrified. "Please don't do that, darling. Let's talk about this. We can work this out, I promise you. You're barking up the wrong tree and blowing everything out of proportion. I promise you, none of it is true." "Don't lie to me. Of course it's true," my mother screamed. I remember gasping in horror, hardly believing what was happening, and when my parents saw me, they became very concerned. "What are you doing up, Janine?" my mother asked me. "It's way past your bedtime. It's already 12 o'clock. Had you not better go back to bed?" came my mother's sweet, reassuring voice that sounded far more edgy than usual. "I heard you shouting at Daddy," I said. "Is everything all right?" "Of course it is, sweetheart," said my mother, taking me in her arms and escorting me up the staircase back to my bedroom, where she tucked me back into bed. "Mummy, why were you fighting with Daddy?" I cried. "It's nothing to worry about, sweetheart. Your Daddy and I just had an argument, but it'll be fine in the morning, I promise you," she assured me, kissing me on the cheek. "But why did you throw the vase?" I cried. "Mummy was just venting her anger, sweetheart, but it was a very silly thing to do." My mother's words were very reassuring and comforting to me, and so I fell asleep, only to be awoken again to my mother's raised, angry voice, yet again. "I'm going to bed now, Ralph," she snapped. "We'll talk about this in the morning." I heard my father's feet running up the staircase. "No," he said. "Let's talk about this now.
I want to resolve this now. It's crazy to go to sleep feeling so mad at each other when this is nothing to be upset about."
"There's a great deal to be upset about, Rolf," came my mother's furious voice. Suddenly I heard a huge thumping noise that ominously sounded like someone had fallen down the staircase. It's a sound that I shall never forget. I immediately got up and raced to the landing. What I saw was so horrifying that I could not comprehend this chilling reality. I saw my mother lying at the bottom of the staircase, and my father was shaking her limp body and weeping and weeping. I saw him clutching my mother's lifeless body in his arms and crying. I recall my mother looked like a pale, fragile mannequin in his desperate, frantic arms. I was so terrified, I ran back to bed, only to be awoken later to the voice of my mother's sister, whom my father had obviously called around to the house. Once again I crept to the landing and looked over the wooden railings to see my father and Diane, and they were embracing and crying. I sat on the staircase, eavesdropping and listening intently to their intense conversations. "We have to cover this up," I heard Diane saying to my dad. "No one can know about this, or you'll go down for murder." "But it was an accident," protested my father. "She fell down the stairs. I didn't push her." "Surely the police would understand that." "You want to take that risk," snapped Diane. "Supposing it all backfires on you, and you go down for life for this. It happens. Is that what you want? You know very well that Victoria would be devastated to see that happen to you. She'd never ever forgive me if I didn't protect you. What about your kids? Do you want them growing up without a father? That would be a grievous evil if ever I saw one. Those kids have lost a mother. They don't need to lose a father as well. Not if I've got anything to do with it, that is." "I blame myself for all this," I heard my dad say. "For goodness sake, Rolf, it was an accident. These tragic things do happen. Yes, you've lost your beautiful wife, and I've lost the most incredible sister. But we can't do anything about that now. But you can't blame yourself. It's hardly your fault. And as for Victoria, she should have trusted you more. Honestly, she should know you better than that, instead of reacting like a bull in a china shop and coming to all kinds of conclusions. Victoria was always prone to overreact. Even when we were kids growing up, she would always jump to the wrong conclusion. She was so good at that." Before long I could see the lifeless body of my mother being rolled in an old Persian carpet, which my father and Diane seemed to be taking somewhere. I was certain they were going to bury her. After that dreadful ordeal, I'm not sure what actually happened to my memory, but I must have suppressed it for some reason, or maybe I just told myself it was all the most terrible nightmare, and it never actually happened. I was to learn later that kids do have the marvellous ability to block traumatic events from their minds, so invariably that must be what happened to me, because I kid you not, many years after this harrowing event, I remembered absolutely nothing. The next day I woke up to the delicious smell of pancakes, which Diane was serving with lashings of maple syrup and vanilla ice cream. I was thrilled because we were never usually allowed to eat ice cream at breakfast. I was surprised to see my mother was not around, and I was rather perturbed as to why Diane was there. But it's amazing how a plate of delicious-looking melt-in-the-mouth pancakes can literally throw off your thoughts. My father was looking at us very seriously as he sat down at the breakfast table, and he passed us plates of pancakes. I could see my dad's eyes look bloodshot. They were so red from crying, and he looked so despairingly sad. I knew something really bad had transpired. My brother and sister were looking at my father in dismay, because he looked so broken, downhearted, and incredibly lost. "Your mother has left us," said my father, "and she's not coming back, but she wants you to know that she really loves you very, very much indeed." "Why did she not say goodbye?" asked Eddie. "And why is she not coming back?" My father began to choke on his words as he fought back tears, and Diane immediately interjected. "Your father's right. Your mother's gone away for a very long time, but she does love you very, very much." It was all as if our probing, curious questions were being pushed away and always blocked by Diane, who seemed determined never to tell us very much. After a while as kids we stopped asking questions, and so did everybody else, as invariably people get caught up in their own lives and always get distracted.
So my mother's absence in our lives did not raise too many quizzical eyebrows or curious questions, as you might imagine. And we had only been in Washington for a few months, so my mother had not made many friends, so not many people were aware that she was actually missing in the first place. I believe Diane and my father did actually file a missing persons report at the police station, but they told the police that my mother was suicidal at the time of her disappearance, and I think it was assumed that she had taken her own life, and so nothing was really done about the case, as no evidence of my mother's body was ever found. My father erected a very beautiful memorial stone for my mother at the local cemetery with its own burial plot, where it stood proudly among all the graves at the cemetery, and as children we would visit it regularly, which was rather strange because if my mother was not dead, why were we visiting her gravesite? Diane always seemed to find an answer for every single question, and she told us that a memorial stone was about remembering the person, whether they were alive or dead. Growing up, the pink elephant in the room was invariably always the subject of my mother, because if we dared mention her name, my father became so incredibly despondent that it was just so heartbreaking for us to observe that we daren't ever raise the subject again. We knew not to ever mention my mother's name. Sometimes I would see my dad flicking through photo albums of happier times with such painful looks of nostalgic yearning on his face, it was unbearable to watch. As my father worked full-time, Diane moved into our home with her long-time boyfriend Larry, and they looked after us, taking charge of the school run and managing our home, and we became like one big happy family together. Diane became like a second mother to us and Larry like a second dad. And we had a very happy, vibrant life, although I always sensed that my dad had a deep underlying sadness and grievous hurt that could never ever be dissipated no matter what. Naturally, there were times as kids, Lydia, Eddie and I would reflect about my mother and ask each other what had actually happened to her and why she left us in the way that she did. But none of us had any real answers, nor were we overly concerned, because we had a very full, jubilant and happy life. So why should we worry anyway? Growing up, we would spend ages out in the woods, and we would often take a picnic lunch with us and eat our sandwiches by the stream that meandered through the wooded valley and was surrounded by huge rocky formations that we would sit on as we watched the gushing stream with its strong, forceful, pulsating current run its watery course through the valley. As children, we enjoyed the soothing sound of the water and adored paddling in the stream and throwing small rocks in the water. Sometimes we would catch little fish with our nets and throw them back into the stream. Other times we would play hide-and-seek in the woods, and we would find great places to hide, such as hollows in trees and overgrown shrubbery and rocky formations. There were always fabulous hiding spots in the woods. There were occasions we would bring our board games like Snakes and Ladders or Monopoly, and we would play them together on one of the elevated, vast, smooth rocks there that was as flat as a table. We loved the woods because they were teeming with wildlife, and I especially adored squirrels because they're so cute, the way they dash so nimbly up the trees and look at you with their wide, brown, curious eyes. One day when I was about 15 years old, I woke up in a dreadful hot sweat, and I was in a huge panic. I knew that I was experiencing the most horrifying, unbelievable, dreadful nightmare. Suddenly the memory of the last night of my mother's life came flooding back with such crystal-clear clarity. I could remember every single detail of that night from 12 whole long years ago. Now, how does that happen? The weird thing is that my recall did not return to me in dribs and drabs, as it invariably does for a lot of people, like a jigsaw you try to put back together again. On the contrary, it came back all at once, in such explicit detail. It was nothing short of extraordinary. I could see my mother's furious face throwing that vase at the wall, and I remember that baleful thudding sound as my mother went flying down the stairs to meet her dreadful demise. I knew it had been an awful accident, and so I wondered why on earth my father had kept it a secret from us for so long. I ran into my father's bedroom, and I shook him violently awake from his very deep sleep. He looked startled to see me waking him up so aggressively and so early in the morning. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" he asked. "You look frantic. Has something happened?" "Dad," I shouted, I remember everything that happened the night Mum died." My father sat bolt upright in bed and said, "You remember?" "Yes, Dad, I remember, and none of it was your fault. Mum died, yes she did, but it was a terrible accident. I began to tell my father absolutely everything I remembered, and we embraced in each other's arms and cried and cried. I cannot believe you recall such details, said my father. And that is indeed what happened. You were only 8 at the time, and you remember so much. It's extraordinary. Why didn't you tell me before? He asked, looking perturbed. Because I've only just remembered now, I said. I've only just remembered everything now. Dad, you and Mum never ever fought. Why was Mum so angry that night, I asked. My dad shook his head. It was all down to that duplicitous secretary of mine that was working for me at the time. She was called Shirley, and she was a nasty, vindictive woman who was always trying to seduce me. I immediately fired her because she was behaving very inappropriately towards me, and it was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for me at the office. I couldn't stand that woman. She made my flesh crawl and was so aggressively flirtatious. I've never seen anything like it. As you can imagine, tongues were wagging all over the office because of the embarrassing overtures Shirley was making towards me. And she made no secret of the crush she had over me. She made it blatantly clear to everybody. I'd come to work and there would be a box of chocolates or fresh doughnuts on my desk from her. Not to mention little notes with little messages on it like, "Have a good day, boss. Love, Shirley." I promise you these women did not know the meaning, well, at least she didn't know the meaning of the word subtle. She'd arrive at work in skin-tight clothes, short skirts and low-cut blouses, leaving nothing to the imagination, and the dressing was definitely for me. I did talk to her about the way she was dressing at work, and told her that it was not the way I wanted her to present herself in front of our clients in our offices, because we were operating a very serious business. When I did tell her, finally, that I needed to sack her because of her inappropriate overtures towards me, she was furious and assured me that I would be very sorry for what I'd done. I had no idea what her idea of payback was, but I was to learn the very next night. When I returned home, the next day after I dismissed Shirley, your mother was acting incredibly standoffish towards me. I'd never observed her behave like that towards me before. That was when she started accusing me of having an affair with Shirley. I gathered the revengeful, spiteful Shirley was not packing any punches, and had phoned your mother and assured her that I was having an affair with her, which was anything but the truth. I even called her pigs in space behind her back, because she reminded me of a spaced-out pig. I think she would get high as a kite sometimes. Well, she looked like it anyway. I was flummoxed that your mother actually believed those acrimonious cow for the lies she was telling. It was extraordinary that your mother would actually believe it, but she did. Mum believed her? I asked in horror. You're the last person in the world that would cheat on your wife. Everybody knows that. Tell that to your mother, Janine. I was devastated that your mother would even believe such a callous lie, but it seemed that Shirley had done a fabulous, cunning job in convincing your mother that I was a terrible cheat. So how did Mum actually fall down the staircase, I asked. I did hear the tumble as she flew down the stairs, but what happened? Your mother wanted to retire to bed early that night, and I was adamant that we talked about things first. My father always used to say, "Never let the sun go down on your grief." I just wanted your mother to hear me out one more time, but she wasn't listening. She was standing with her back to the staircase, and I was facing her, trying to talk her round, and I remember she pushed me very hard, and then she tripped in her new shoes and lost her footing and went flying backwards down the stairs, where she landed. Oh, it was awful. Dad, I said, you should have informed the police about what happened. You put yourself through a living hell. All could have been avoided if you'd actually told the police. I'm sure the autopsy would have confirmed your account, and then you would have healed so much better. You've had to go through this all on your own for so many years. It's all so crazy. It's too late for that now, said my father. What's done is done. I think your Aunt Diane was convinced I'd go down for murder, and she felt that we needed to cover the accident up. She was very worried about what would happen to you kids if I was to be laid up in prison. There were so many considerations, but losing you kids was just not an option, not for me, nor for Diane. We couldn't let that happen. Not a chance. I was to find out from my father that Diane and my father had actually gone to the woods and buried my mother in a deep grave wrapped up in the Persian carpet. I persuaded my father to actually dig up my mother's remains and take them back to her burial site, as they would likely only be bones by now. We could dig a smaller grave and then place her bones at the proper plot at the cemetery, because my mother did indeed deserve a final resting place. And surprisingly enough, my father entirely agreed. Soon my father told my other siblings what had actually happened to my mother, and although they were sad, they really did not have enough of a memory of her to really grieve her. As far as my siblings were concerned, Diane was indeed their real mother, because growing up she was the only one that had filled my mother's shoes, and she was a brilliant mother at that to each and every one of us, so why would they be sad? One night my father, Eddie, and I went into the wooded area where my mother was buried, and my father found the spot where he believed the corpse would be found. So he began to dig while my brother and I stood around the grave, watching. My father dug, and just when we were getting close to the Persian carpet, the top of my father's trowel just broke off like that, and so he needed to return to the house to get another trowel from the yard shed. It was a very irritating event. I remember we were rather frustrated by this setback, but my father could not dig with the bottom of a trowel, so we had no choice but to wait for my dad to finally come back. I remember the night so clearly because it was incredibly creepy, sinister and airy, and even Eddie pointed out that there were no singing crickets, croaking frogs, or even owl calls, and the woods were incredibly quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. This was incredibly odd because we were used to the woods, and they were usually alive with owl calls and coyotes and all kinds of animals, but not tonight, not on this occasion. It was incredibly silent. We heard absolutely nothing, and it really did make us feel a little on edge. My brother and I were very uneasy, but we decided to wait by the grave, and moments after he had gone, we suddenly heard this thundering noise that sounded like a rhino in a thicket, and it was heading directly towards us at such a fast speed that Eddie and I were quite terrified. In truth, it sounded almost ghostly. It was almost supernatural in its sound. Immediately we went to hide behind an oak tree that overlooked my mother's resting place. We quickly turned off our flashlights, and thankfully it was a full moon that night, so the moonlight literally dappled the forest floor in a very pretty white light, and surprisingly we could see remarkably well. We heard the creature before we actually saw it. The critter was grunting, snorting and breathing very heavily, sounding unlike anything that I've ever heard before. Even but before I actually got to see the critter, I sensed it was colossal, because I could feel the powerful energy that it exuded, that made you fully aware that you were in the presence of an apex predator. Call it a sixth sense if you like. I cannot explain it, but you just sense and know it intuitively. When I peered around the tree, I saw the critter, and it was unlike anything that I've ever observed or seen before in my entire life. This thing was like a human giant. It was massive, and when I say huge, we are talking about titanic. This creature would make a tall human being appear small and inconspicuous because it was about 11 foot tall, 5 feet wide, and easily over 1,000 pounds. The body was covered in long, shaggy, dark hair, which could have easily been auburn or very dark brown, but it was not light enough for me to distinguish the exact colour of the hair. The critter was very strong, sinewy, thick, muscular and burly, with very long, overlong arms and a cone-shaped face. I could not distinguish all the features of the face, but I did observe a very evident red eye shine. To my horror, the creature was observing the recently dug grave with a somewhat perturbed look on his face, as if he was saying, "What on earth is this, and what is it doing here?" He couldn't understand why there was a big square hollow in the middle of the woods, and he was scratching his head as though very confused. Suddenly he appeared to study it a little bit more closely and intently, with very keen eyes, as if something had suddenly caught his eye. To my horror, the critter jumped into the hollow and was digging away at the grave, working far more efficiently than my father had done, with a trowel, I might add. I watched it using its huge hands and sausage-like sized fingers, and finally it succeeded in dragging out of the ground a very large Persian carpet, which he unrolled. To our amazement, my mother's scant remains just fell out of the carpet, landing all over the forest floor, and it seemed that there were no more than a few little bones. The creature was very surprised by this, but he discarded my mother's bones like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle with very little interest. I could see he was far more interested in the Persian carpet itself, which for some reason, although having been buried for so long, was not in terrible condition, I might add. I would have expected the wool to have been eaten away, but it did not appear to be the case, which I thought was exceedingly peculiar. The creature was thrilled with the rug, because he began to make these delighted whooping sounds, as if he'd found some long-lost treasure, and then he rolled the carpet, tugged it under his arms like a lightweight yoga mat, and glided away, whistling happily to himself. "What the heck was that?" asked my brother. "Did you see it?" I nodded. "It was like a cross between a human and an ape," I said. "I've never seen anything like it before. It's like a creature out of the Twilight Zone." My brother and I were so stunned by what we'd actually seen that we barely said a word to each other as we gathered what was left of my mother's bones that lay scattered across the ground. I was able to place them in my cardigan, and we began to throw all the soil back into the grave, and when my father finally did return, he was amazed that we'd recovered the bones and proceeded to fill in the grave with the bottom of the trowel. I think he assumed we had left the carpet in the grave, but we decided not to tell him the crazy thing that had actually transpired while he went back to the house to retrieve the trowel. My brother and I did not talk for many years about the strange critter that we had seen and observed in the woods, because we could not make any sense of the creature anyway. And we told no one. We told no friends, no family members, absolutely no one, because we didn't think in our gut that anybody would actually believe our story anyway. It sounds so incredulous, we found it hard to believe ourselves, so why should anybody believe us? I'm glad to say we were able to bury my mother's bone in her gravesite without anybody suspecting anything. We just looked like we were planting seedlings on her spot. We performed a very little ceremony for her around the grave and said our final farewells. It was a very sad and moving occasion. It was only after the burial that my father was able to move on, and he did marry a lovely lady called Christine. So about a year later or so, we ended up with 2 mothers and dads, which was so cool because by this stage in our lives, Diane and Larry were very much fixture and fittings in our lives, and we couldn't live without them. One day, many years later, we saw a program called Finding Bigfoot, and then my brother and I knew at once what we had seen that night in the woods, and we became incredibly excited. My father laughed and said, "There is no way that a creature like that could exist in our forests because we'd know about it." Eddie and I looked at each other and winked because we knew that Bigfoot was indeed real. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, a soft shaft of sunlight stealthily stole its way through the crack in the curtain, casting its light across the face of the young woman, whose long blonde hair lay sprawled over the dipped dent in the goose-down pillow. Nola Miller opened one eye, followed by another. Her eyes were heavily congealed with sleep, but the intrusive sunlight, strategically aimed on her pillow, caused her to squint from its invasively bright glare. She found herself looking up at the ceiling and noted its ornate rococo twirls. She realized to her horror that this was not her own apartment. Where the heck was she? The cruel blast of sunshine blow-dried her face with its warm fingers. She noticed her head was thumping violently with the drumming beats of a headache. Her parched throat was dry. There was a bitter, acrid taste in the back of her mouth, the foul oral infusion you often get from overindulging in alcohol, while her tongue felt thick and furry. Where was she? The full horror that she was not lying safely curled up in her cosy bed at home filled her with dread. What the hell had she done? It was when she glanced down at the gloriously crisp Egyptian cotton sheets of the luxurious sleigh bed she was lying in that her worst, most dreadful fears were confirmed. Her head spun around to observe the lumpy form lying in bed next to her, the long, lean, naked body of a man with honey-coloured skin and curly blonde locks. A haunting recollection of this man came flooding back into her mind. His name was Timothy. She had met him only last night at the bar in town and enjoyed a few drinks with him, but she remembered nothing beyond that. It seemed her inhibitions had been crushed, washed away. She must have returned home with this random stranger to his apartment. She glanced down in horror at her immodest body, wrapped in a long sheet. She was totally naked, and her beleaguered clothes were lying in abandoned sorry heaps across the floor, in tangled puddles along with the stranger's clothes. Oh my God, she thought, I've slept with this man, and I don't even remember the events of the previous evening. I guess I must have got so bladdered with all those champagne cocktails I knocked back. I must have really overdone it. Nola knew she had a weakness when she had one drink. It always seemed to lead to another, and another, and another, and now it had directed her straight to a stranger's bed. The sense of self-loathing, disgust, and revulsion she felt towards herself rushed through her like the furiously angry water jutting over the rocks of an obstreperous stream. If her father could see her right now, she thought, he'd feel so much disappointment, such dreadful shame. No daughter of his should demean herself like this. She was no floozy. Her father would have described the folly that she had clearly got caught up in now to be meaningless under the sun, and she would agree with him wholeheartedly with that. Her father was right about so many things. She could almost see him shaking his shiny bald head, looking at her through his blue wizened eyes, and saying, "Nola, Nola, I'm disappointed in you. You're better than this." She had been raised to be a good, dignified Catholic girl, and girls like her should have some self-respect. In the hazy whirl of her confusion, Nola tried to bring the estranged pieces of the previous evening back together again, like a jumbled jigsaw puzzle. She had gone on to Tinder, a dating website, as her friend Alison had persuaded her it was a great idea. Why did she ever listen to Alison? Her well-meaning friend's crazy ideas always ended up going pear-shaped in the end, and invariably getting her into heaps of trouble. "Nola, you've been moping around for weeks on end after you and Freddie split up. You need to have fun, girl. Let your hair down, for goodness sake. Blow caution to the wind." Yes, she thought, I needed to have some fun, but I did not want this to happen. A good time, yes, but warming somebody else's bed up had been the furthest thing on her mind. There was something so soullessly empty and vacuous about lying in a stranger's bed, smelling the unfamiliar scent of their aftershave, and feeling like a goldfish that had been thrown into another pond and had become disorientated and confused. "I've got to get out of here," she thought, as all of a sudden she felt like a claustrophobic caged bird that desperately needed to escape the confines of its cage. It would seem unfamiliar territory, can close in on you, and drain away your sense of comfort like a blood-sucking leech. She tiptoed awkwardly towards the curtain and peeked out of the apartment window. She was in a posh brownstone neighbourhood, with tall lofty oak trees fringing each side of the pavement. The sleepy street was bask in the restful first light of the early morning, steeped in a tranquil silence. She had no idea where she was, but the urgent need to leave the apartment before the stranger in the bed next to her rose from his peaceful slumber was all-consuming. This would be the last time she ever went on Tinder. This could never happen to her again. She closed the curtains fully to block out the sunlight and tiptoed across the wooden parquet floor, in her shameful, self-conscious nakedness, between the puddles of clothes that looked like water lilies on a brown lake. She felt like a frog, bounding between them, hopping from one pile of clothes to another. Finally she found her dishevelled, crumpled Levi jeans that stank of stale cigarette smoke. She hurriedly wiggled into them and threw on her sweatshirt, but as the chafing fabric brushed against her skin, she was terribly afraid that the sounds would wake the sleeping man. She grabbed her purse, glancing briefly at the slumped figure, still lying in bed, emitting a low snore. "Please God, don't you dare wake up," she thought, as the embarrassed awkwardness of meeting the stranger in the cold, cruel light of day, after the hazy blur of the previous night, would not be a comfortable experience at all. Nola took in a deep breath, straightened her back, and clandestinely tiptoed through the apartment, wondering if she could easily escape. The front door opened seamlessly. She closed it discreetly behind her. Further down the street, as luck would have it, she managed to hail down a taxicab to her own apartment. She pulled out her cell phone to call Alison.
She'd kill that woman. She had got her into the sticky mess. It was all her fault. "Hello," came Alison's sluggishly sleepy voice. "Why are you calling me so early? I'm so tired. Do you realise what time it is?" she yawned. "Did you have a good time last night? Your date? He was really handsome, wasn't he?" Nola growled. "Don't you ever do anything to me like this again. Do you understand, Alison? This was your crazy idea, for me to hook up on Tinder with this guy. I ended up waking up in his bed." "That's good, isn't it?" came Alison's voice. "So you had a good time then? I'm so glad. That was the whole idea, wasn't it? Hopefully now you can move on from Freddie. Stop mooching around the place, feeling sorry for yourself." "Are you even listening to a word I'm saying, Alison? Thanks to your crazy, nonsensical idea, I ended up bladdered. And then I ended up waking up in the strange man's bed and creeping out of his apartment. I feel like a cheap slut, thanks to you. I've never felt more humiliated in my entire life. This is not for me, Alison. I don't do this kind of thing." "Oh, for goodness sake, Nola, stop being so hard on yourself. Of course you're not a slut. You just had a good time. That's all that counts. Tinder is great that way, when consenting adults meet each other and have a good time. Nothing wrong with that. Everyone does it. Quit acting like Mother Teresa." "Alison, waking up in a perfect stranger's bed after an evening of drinking and not remembering a bloody thing is not my idea of fun. You were at the bar. Why didn't you stop me leaving with this guy? Surely you must have seen I was in no state to make any cognitive decisions. I was obviously completely intoxicated. The scariest thing is I don't remember a bloody thing. After those potent cocktails, nothing at all. Do you have any idea how terrifying that is? How would you feel waking up in a perfect stranger's bed and you have no memory of how you even got there? It's not funny. I blame you for this, Alison. This was your ludicrous idea." "But you look like you were having a wonderful time, Nola. You were throwing yourself all over that Timothy fellow. I thought you were quite taken by each other. I had no idea you weren't enjoying yourself. You looked incredibly happy. You couldn't stop giggling." "Alison, are you really that dim? Do you know nothing about alcohol? It can make a chair with a wobbly leg look drop-dead gorgeous. But I'd have rather woken up with a wobbly chair in my bed than a perfect stranger. At least I'd still have my dignity intact. I have no idea what happened between me and this stranger, no idea at all. But I can only imagine, and the idea fills me with dread." "But you liked his profile on Tinder. He was so handsome. If you must know, even though his name was Timothy Cox, his picture on Tinder was not the same one. The man I met last night was better looking than the man on the photograph in Tinder. He said his secretary put up the wrong photograph of his friend by mistake. Sounds a bit fishy to me. I'd never ever want to see him again. A man who takes advantage of you like this when you're half cut is certainly no gentleman." "I suppose you're right," said Alison. "I'm sorry, Nola. I got you into the sticky mess, but I had no idea that you weren't into him." 2 weeks later, Nola feels slightly nervous as the taxi approaches the large Georgian manor house, nestled in the heart of the South Carolina countryside, the perfect venue for her sister's wedding. She was arriving today for the pre-wedding dress rehearsal, which would be followed by a beautiful evening meal spent with her family and the groom's family that was to be served in the main dining hall. The following afternoon would be the wedding that would take place on the viridescent lawns of this illustrious property under an arched pergola covered with bountiful climbing roses, where her sister would be married by Father MacArthur, a very good friend of the family. This would soon be followed by a grandiose reception in the marquee, where no expense had been spared, as the groom's parents had deep pockets, and they would be footing the entire bill. There would be over 150 people in attendance. Nola had almost despised her sister for all her lucky breaks that had flooded her life with a tsunami of opportunity that never came her way. Izzy was one of those people that was annoyingly, serendipitously, always at the right place at the right time, for fate to fill her arms with its gleeful golden rewards. whereas Nola was the one more likely to step in the dog turd she failed to see on the pavement, or to attract that infuriating dog on the street who would dash over to her and begin humping her leg with a frenzied passion, to the amusement of all the spectators. And yes, that had happened over a plethora of times. Nothing like that ever happened to Izzy. Everything about her sister's life just flowed seamlessly. Nola was always the one who ended up venturing down the rocky paths and precariously high bluffs from which she could so easily have lost her footing and come crashing down with a mighty wallop. But it would seem Izzy's life was like a clear day spent relaxing on a turquoise ocean, where the sail from her boat never even got remotely ruffled by the wind. Why was it that some people just had it so good, while others struggled to get afloat and limped from one day to the next? Izzy had always annoyingly received top grades when she was a child, and had boyfriends who had always won her father's approval. Whereas, by contrast, some of the bedraggled boys that Nola had brought back home over the years looked like something the cat had dragged in. There was Eddie Estelle, for example, with his carefree manner and dopey look, who looked like he hung around on the beach all day, riding the waves on his surfboard, and beyond that had absolutely nothing to say. Then there had been that boyfriend, what was his name? Oh yes, Carlton Hefner, who had joined an obscure heavy metal band, wore his hair around his face in a long brown crinkly frizz, a headband around his head, black clothes and piercings in every available orifice, who had auditioned over and over and over again for various record companies, and had always been turned away. He was hanging on to an impossible, unattainable dream, like a koala bear on a eucalyptus tree. He had been rough around the edges, and exciting to Nola, but his clamorous blasting music had almost shattered her eardrums. Let's just say her father had not been impressed by any of her boyfriends.
"Nola, why is it that you choose the most nonconformist men?" he'd say. "You would do well to take a leaf out of your sister's book. She is very discerning when it comes to her boyfriends."
Izzy had sailed through life with boyfriends that every parent would be proud to embrace as a potential son-in-law. As Nola glances outside the taxi window, she wondered about this mysterious man her sister was going to marry, for she'd never had the pleasure to meet him.
I know I should have told you before, Nola, but we wanted to keep our relationship hush-hush, her sister explained. We've been together for 2 years, and I'm hopelessly in love with him. He popped the question, Nola, on a glorious yacht in the Caribbean. So romantic it was. He's got very wealthy parents with old money. The family made their fortune from coal, you know. I can't believe we're getting married, she squealed in delight. It's so wonderful. Oh, my God, I can't wait. He's only picked out the dream venue for us. His parents are paying for absolutely everything. It's a gorgeous manor house in the heart of South Carolina countryside. It's to die for. I'm going to feel like a princess on my wedding day. I can hardly wait, Nola. Nola felt a pang of jealousy twitching her throat. Her sister was getting married. As usual, at the end of her fishing line, she was pulling out a spectacular golden carp. When there was a tug at Nola's line, she always ended up with a shriveled-up fish the size of a new penny. Why was her sister always so fortunate? I'm happy for you, she said, her voice sounding as flat as a bottle of champagne that had lost all its fizz. Don't be like that, Nola. All right, I'm sorry I never introduced you to him, but in truth he was reluctant to meet you guys until we were sure about our feelings for each other, if you understand. Nola did not understand or appreciate her sister's secrecy. It diminished their close bond. For a moment she felt like a complete outsider in her sister's life, as if she didn't know her at all. It was ironic they lived so close to each other in New York, and not once had her sister had the decency to mention her boyfriend. When Nola had inquired about her love life, she had been so nonchalant and evasive, when all the while she was engaged in a serious relationship. How about Mum and Dad? I hope you managed to introduce him to them. Oh, of course I have. It was over a month ago. You would have met him yourself then, but you came down with that unfortunate bout of chicken pox, if you remember. Don't tell me, said Nola. Mum and Dad thought the moon shone out of his backside.
Was Dad licking his shoes like he did with all your other boyfriends? Oh, for goodness sake, Nola. What's got into you? If I didn't know any better, I'd say you were jealous. Of course Dad liked him. Mum loved him too. I mean, what's there not to like about golden honey skin, blonde hair, and the bluest eyes you could almost swim in? I have to pinch myself, Nola. I can't believe how lucky I am to be marrying this man. He's an up-and-coming art dealer, you know. Loaded, lives in a brownstone apartment in Brooklyn Heights. I'll be moving in there after we get married. I'm happy for you, Izzy. Really I am. But I am annoyed that you never introduced me to him. In case you've forgotten, I'm your sister. You've made me feel very discluded in your life. Don't be like this, Nola. It hasn't got anything to do with me, it's Piers. He's just a very private person who keeps himself to himself. But you'll meet him at the wedding. I know you're going to love him. I'd like you to be my maid of honour. I really would. So why don't you WhatsApp me your measurements? I'll get a stunning dress designed especially for you, and you're going to love it. I've decided to go with emerald green and white for the wedding. Won't that be perfect? Sounds lovely, said Nola bleakly. Nola, I've just asked you to be my maid of honour, and you sound as if I've invited you to a funeral. Well, can you blame me for being upset, Izzy? This is the first time I've heard that you've got a boyfriend, and now you're getting married. Not even Mum and Dad even told me about this man of yours. Now you're inviting me to your wedding. I feel as if I've been flung around in a washing cycle. Forgive me if I'm trying to assimilate everything you're telling me, but it's come as a bolt out of the blue. But of course, I am delighted to be your maid of honour. Thanks for asking me. I appreciate that. The taxi finally parks outside the grandiose Georgian manor house. The silence interrupted by the gravelly voice of the taxi driver. $25.50, he says. Keep the change, says Nola, thrusting some notes into his hand. The stunning, very stately-looking red brick building, with its impressive rigid symmetry, smiles back at her. The soft shadows of morning sunshine twinkle over the red-bricked walls, contrasting superbly with the white bricks that frame the large multi-pane sash windows and cornices. There is a side-gabled grey slate roof, and a very elegant front door, framed by an archway and columns. Nola climbs rather reluctantly out of the taxi, removing her rather bedraggled wheel-along suitcase that had been scuffed from years of overuse from the taxi's trunk. The taxi soon leaves her behind, as it descends down the long gravel driveway rather gradually, until it is all but a minuscule dot on the landscape. Nola processes the prepossessing views that demand her attention like a glorious Monet painting. It would seem hiring a grand country manor house like this had not come cheap, for the house was sumptuously nestled among rolling viridescent quilts of sumptuous countryside that branched out into sweeping woodgroves of tall, lofty trees. The sprawling front yard boasted pristine geometric hedges, white roses and blue delphiniums, that merrily danced through the flower beds in a blaze of colour, while cheerful hanging geraniums tumbled like laughter from red terracotta pots. Then in pride of place, proudly nuzzling the centre of the verdant lawn, was a fabulously swanky designer marquee that looked like an excellent piece of contemporary artwork. Then there were exquisite pieces of wicker furniture, luxuriously upholstered with plumped-up cushioning, and vibrant scatter cushions strewn across the lawn for all the wedding guests to thoroughly enjoy. All of a sudden the front door of this mansion was ebulliently flung open, and Izzy came running across the lawn to greet her, squealing with delight, her arms outstretched. She reminded Nola of an Afghan hound, with the enthusiasm of a Jack Russell Terrier. She was wearing a cotton dress in black that looked eclectic and artsy, with a pair of trendy-looking leather sandals that snaked up her slender ankles in an elegant stringy design. She grabbed Nola and squeezed her tightly. "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. This is so exciting. Let's get the butler over there to take your suitcase up to your room. I have got to introduce you to Piers. Oh my God, you're just going to love him. I think the two of you will get on so well." Nola felt like a little girl again, as her sister grabbed her by the hand enthusiastically, leading her through to the back of the mansion, where a small gathering of people were collected together in a convivial group, chatting around merrily under a large arched terrace overlooking a kidney-shaped swimming pool, drinking elegant cocktails. She could see her mother and Dad, and then she found herself staring at a familiar face.
and her blood turned cold.
Piers! Piers! Said Izzy excitedly, unable to suppress her childlike giggles. This is my sister Nola, that I've been telling you all about. Nola, this is Piers.
When Piers looked at Nola, he managed to suppress his shocked reaction.
Hello, he said, reaching out to shake her hand. Delighted to meet you, Nola, he said, staring at her through his blue eyes. Izzy has told me all about you.
Has she now? Said Nola sarcastically, managing an awkward giggle.
I hope it's been all good. Oh, but of course. Izzy raves about her little sister.
She couldn't believe that the man she was looking at right now was no other than her date from Tinder, Piers McStratton, who had hidden under the alias Timothy Cox. It would seem he had cunningly put on a fake profile and photograph on the Tinder website and got away with it. Nola had been shocked at the time that the man she had met bore no resemblance at all to his photograph, but as he was better looking than his profile, she hadn't raised any questionable brows. But now she realised that Piers McStratton was a rat. It was clear from the flicker of recognition in Piers's face that he was rattled to see Nola again, as she was to see him. Nola knew that Piers was nothing more than a cheat. The rest of the day went like a hazy blur for her. Her mind whirled all over the place with a conundrum of what she should do about this tumultuous situation that had the potential of blowing up in her face like a firecracker. Should she say something and let her sister marry a treacherous man who would ultimately end up breaking her heart? Sooner or later, his cheating would be discovered. And what if Izzy had children with this man, who ended up being raised in a broken home? The rehearsal dinner came and went, and the celebratory mood was festive, as everyone was on top form, and Nola's parents seemed as beguiled and dewy-eyed by their promising new son-in-law. Could they not see through the blonde hair and blue-eyed veneer? Were they that easily duped? Nola's boyfriends may not have been all that, but they weren't artfully manipulative and cunning like Izzy's future spouse.
Oh, there you are, Nola dear. It's so good to see you. I'm so thrilled for our Izzy, her mother had told her. So incredibly thrilled. I've never ever seen her so radiant. Those two are hopelessly in love with each other. Piers is so terribly good for her. Did you see the huge engagement ring he had specially designed for her? Any fool can see he didn't skimp on the expense. That rock is enormous.
Yes, it is quite a showstopper, isn't it? Nola agreed.
Well, you know our Izzy. She always liked the finer things in life. I'm in no doubt that Piers will keep her in a manner that she's accustomed.
Do you know anything about him, Mum? Asked Nola obsequiously. I mean, how do you know he's as decent as you claim? You've only met him once.
Oh, goodness gracious, sweetheart. Listen to yourself. Quite the cynic, aren't you? Anyone can see he's a very good man. And if he makes Izzy happy, then what more can I ask for? If my daughter is happy, then I'm happy. Besides, from what I hear, he's a very successful art dealer. She turned to look at Nola earnestly. I'm only sad, dear, that you haven't met anyone special yourself to sweep you off your feet like Izzy. Your sister's been very lucky in love, hasn't she, over the years? But with Piers, she's hit the jackpot. What a terribly charming man. Really quite the charmer.
Where did they meet? Asked Nola.
Now, that's a very good question, dear. I believe it was on some dating website. That's right, I think that's what it was.
Tinder? I asked.
Yes, they met on Tinder. It's rather an amusing story, really. Piers put up a fake profile, would you believe it? When your sister met him, she found herself staring at a completely different man to whom she was expecting, with a different name as well. Of course he told her his real name, that he didn't want to put up his real details on the dating site, which is understandable for a man of his calibre. As he put it to your sister, he likes to be ex-directory. He doesn't want his real details getting spread across the World Wide Web, and who can blame him for that? Let's just say he's a very shrewd man.
Nola felt quite nauseous when she returned to bed that night. The evening had swept by so fast, and it would seem that Piers had been casting her worried looks all evening. Nola hadn't been able to eat much at dinner, and had fiddled with her food.
She suspected her parents thought she was suffering from a touch of the green-eyed monster. She had overheard her mother saying to her dad, "Have you seen how subdued Nola was this evening? She hasn't been herself, barely said a word, and didn't eat much food, I have to tell you. I think it's very hard on our daughter to see her sister Izzy so happy, having found the quintessential love of her life, when her own personal relationships with men have all ended up scrambled, rather like scrap metal."
"Well, it's understandable, isn't it, in the circumstances, that she would be envious," came her father's voice. "I mean, if I was a woman, I'd marry Piers myself. He ticks all the right boxes, does he not? Poor Nola. She's never been very lucky in love, has she? I think she was quite taken by Piers. I couldn't help but notice her casting him surreptitious glances all evening."
"Oh, how I wish we could set her up with someone nice. But you know Nola. She doesn't have a good track record in choosing the right men. We've been introduced to some sorry sights over the years. Remember that dopey surfer kid? Too dreadful he was." Nola did not need to listen to her parents discuss the sorry state of her love life, so with deflated spirits she returned to her bedroom suite. She slipped into her pyjamas and stared around the gorgeous room, with its luxurious four-poster bed, along with the opulent ornate walnut furnishings brushed with Rococo influences that gave her the sense she was staying in a king's palace. She slipped her body into the silken sheets and switched off the bedside lamp. "I can't ruin my sister's big day. I just can't," she told herself. "She is so incredibly happy. I've never seen her this happy before. Besides, the groom's family has spent such a fortune on this wedding. If I come along and tear everything apart, I'm not sure Izzy will ever forgive me for that." Soon Nola had fallen into a deep sleep. She awoke with a sudden start, having been badly prickled by the nudging of her conscience that whispered to her, "Tell her the truth, tell her the truth, tell her the truth." Sweat was pouring down Nola's forehead in immodest rivulets. It trickled down her back and across her upper lip. She dabbed her face with a hand towel, her heart pounding violently against her rib cage, while a sickly taste of a reluctant dread coated the back of her throat. It wouldn't be right for Izzy to go forward in this marriage, being blind-sighted. I have to tell her the truth. Piers had met Nola under the fictitious name of Timothy Cox, along with a fake photograph. There is no telling how long he'd been playing these duplicitous charades, or indeed how many women he had picked up this way. It should have been a red flag to her from the very beginning. Timothy had plied her with alcohol to take advantage of her, so that in her oblivion she had awoken in his brownstone apartment. He was engaged to her sister Izzy when he'd hooked up with her, so it was very likely he would continue these deceptive shenanigans long after he'd married Izzy. Once a rat, always a rat. Nola's heart became heavy as she anticipated how her sister would react to her startling revelations. She knew she was stuck between a rock and a hard place. She'd be damned if she said anything, and damned if she didn't. Yet how could she live with herself if she didn't tell Izzy the truth? She may have been jealous of her sister Izzy, but never in a million years would she wish on her such grievous misfortune. Izzy was hopelessly in love with Piers, that was true, but she doubted the love was truly reciprocated. For if this man really loved Izzy like he claimed, he would not have been picking up women behind her back and cheating on her like this. I will be responsible for breaking up a fabulous wedding tomorrow, with a wrecking ball, with my own words, she thought. But I really haven't got a choice in the matter, have I? She reluctantly climbed out of bed. A soft prism of moonlight filtered through the open crack in the curtain, so that her room was doused in a silvery light. She grabbed her dressing gown and slippers that had been flung haphazardly over the plump upholstered ottoman. Her fingers trembled as she pushed her arms through the sleeve of the gown and knotted up the rope-like belt around her middle, while slipping her feet into velvety slippers that felt warm. She glanced at her bedside clock. It was 12:30 at night. Everyone knew brides needed their beauty sleep, and waking up Izzy at this god-forsaken time would not meet with an auspicious reception. She knew Izzy was sleeping in the large, grandiose bridal suite at the end of the corridor, with its flamboyant over-the-top king-sized four-poster bed, luxuriously decked out with the finest Egyptian linens.
She was not sleeping with her fiancé tonight on the eve of her wedding. Nola felt like a blowfly drowning in a jar of syrup, drenched by the tangled stickiness of the choice she was forced to make. She gritted her teeth, bit her lip, and finally opened the door to her bedroom. The sleeping house was steeped in a tranquil silence. Everything was very still. The only noise was the pitter-patter of her slippered feet as they quietly glided down the lavish carpeted corridor. The window allowed the light of a full moon to magnanimously permeate the hallway. Finally she came to the door with a sign that read, "The McClare Bridal Suite," and she tried the door handle, pushing it down with her hands. She expected it to be locked, but to her amazement the door opened without so much as a creak. She tiptoed furtively towards her sister's bed. Her sister's svelte figure was swallowed up by a bed, easily the size of a small room. Izzy lay there, so peacefully swathed in the luxurious sheets, her blonde hair splayed over the pillows like a beautiful sleeping princess. Nola stared down at Izzy, her heart consumed with a vacillating reluctance. There was a big part of her that wanted to retreat out of the bedroom and forget all about this. All of a sudden her sister sat up, her blue eyes filled with terror. She was about to scream out, but when the moonlight washed over her sister's face from a crack in the curtain, her horrified face turned into an expression of infuriated astonishment. "What the hell, Nola? You scared me half to death! I woke up to see this figure crouching over me. I thought you were the bogey man. What the hell are you doing in my bedroom? I'm getting married tomorrow afternoon. I need my beauty sleep. I don't appreciate you sneaking up to me like this and waking me up like this in the middle of the night. What the hell has got into you?" Nola stumbled on her words, trying desperately to find them, but a fog developed in the back of her throat. Finally she managed to speak. "It's about your fiancé. You can't possibly marry him. You just can't." "Oh my God! I had no idea you were this jealous, Nola. I've known you were afflicted by the green-eyed monster before, but this is insane. Of course I must marry Piers. I love him. More to the point, we love each other. Get over it, Nola, for God's sake. You're a big girl now. Surely you would not begrudge me a bit of happiness." "I don't know how to tell you this, Izzy, but 2 weeks ago, after drinking too much in a bar, I ended up in bed with your fiancé. I woke up in his brownstone apartment. I never meant it to happen. I had no idea he was your fiancé at the time. I'm really sorry." "You what?" asked Izzy, growling. "You what?" "Say that again." "You heard me. 2 weeks ago I met up with a man on Tinder who claimed to be a chap called Timothy Cox. He had a very pleasing profile, a very attractive photograph, and no thanks to my friend Alison, I accepted a date with him. When my date arrived, he looked nothing like his online profile. The photograph was not the same as the person. Instead, he was actually much better looking than the photograph. I commented that his photograph was different, and he just waved it off. He told me that his secretary, who had been helping him with his Tinder profile, had put on the wrong picture by mistake, but the right name, which sounded a bit absurd to me. Now I realise after meeting your fiancé, both were false. Your Piers ploughed me with too much champagne. I'm ashamed to say that the next morning I found myself lying naked in his bed, at his brownstone apartment in Brooklyn Heights. I had no memory of getting there, or even the events of that evening. I felt so filthy, so cheap, such self-revulsion. But I was responsible for my inebriation. I can't exactly blame that on him. Nevertheless, it didn't stop your fiancé, this so-called perfect gentleman, from taking advantage of me in my bladdered state." Izzy stared at her sister, her face growing white and then crimson. Her teeth began to grind in her jaw. 2 weeks ago, you mean? You went on a date with my Piers? Is that what you're telling me? And he pretended to be this Timothy Cox fellow? Nola nodded. "I'm so sorry, Izzy. I didn't want to tell you. I really didn't. I don't know what to say." "We've been together for 2 years, and he does this to me. I'll kill him," she growled. "I'll bloody kill him. Why would he do this to me? Do those sound like the actions of a man committed to his spouse? It's a bloody joke."
Nola nodded. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The tears spilled down her cheeks. You are right, Izzy. I am jealous of you. I always have been. You're beautiful. You're clever. You're successful. But I'd never wish this on you, never. I just wish I could tell you something different. I didn't want to tell you this. In truth, I got the shock of my life when I actually saw your Piers, because I recognised him as Timothy Cox, and that he was your fiancé. He also recognised me at once and became incredibly uncomfortable. I bet he bloody did, said Izzy. I bet he did, treacherous little liar. I bloody hate him. To think I was going to marry him tomorrow. Am I a fool or what? Have I got cauliflower for brains? I mean, he's always telling me he's working late, or he has to go away on a conference for a few days. Sometimes I was suspicious, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. My guess is he's been hooking up with girls on Tinder under this fake profile for a very long time. And that's how he gets away with it. What a jerk! Izzy leapt out of bed. She looked furious. There was no telling what she was going to do. Izzy, why don't we go for a walk together? Nola hurriedly suggested. There's a full moon out there. It's lovely in the wood grove. We could take some champagne out there, a couple of glasses and talk. You don't want to do anything rash. We can talk it through together. Tomorrow you can decide whether you want to call off your wedding or not. Call it off? Of course I'm going to bloody call it off, Nola. There's no way I'm marrying that jerk. What a loser! Nola pulls out her cell phone from her dressing gown. Look here, she says, showing her sister a picture of Timothy Cox that she had responded to. The profile still remained on Twitter. Oh my God, gasped Izzy, staring at the profile on the cell phone. I can't believe he did this to me. You know what, sis? I think I should take you up on your idea. Let's go for a walk in the wood grove, like you suggest, or I don't know what I'm going to do. We can take a bottle of champagne with us. There is no way I can get back to sleep after what you've told me. Besides, it'll be fun taking a walk under a full moon. Nola was surprised that Izzy had reacted to the news about her fiancé's philandering ways better than she could have envisaged. She wondered if deep down in her sister's gut there was a knowing rooted in the pit of her stomach that told her something was off about her relationship with Piers. She had often heard that people sometimes knew things that they refused to acknowledge to themselves, as they didn't want to admit them to be true. The two women stealthily crept down the sweeping staircase and headed towards the large state-of-the-art kitchen, where Izzy removed a bottle of the finest French champagne, along with a couple of champagne flutes from the cold storage area. Then, armed with a couple of flashlights, they trudged over to the well-oiled front door. Soon they were greeted by friendly, spirited gusts of fresh air, filled with the scent of jasmine and lilacs, while the trills of crickets and frogs serenaded the night with their joyful choruses. The two sisters nimbly ambled along the moist dewy grass that brushed against their sweats. The white marquee was parked so elegantly on the lawn, and was prettily dappled by the glistening moonlit shadows. Nola had been in a woods at night before, but not here at this particular wedding venue, and being out in the woods in the middle of the night gave her an irrational thrill. There was something so bewitching, so beguiling, about the way the ethereal, almost haunting shafts of moonlight danced buoyantly through the canopy of the trees. The trees themselves seemed to whisper as they jiggled in the breeze, their boughs thrashing around noisily, while their leaves rustled. Izzy stopped dead in her tracks. Did you hear that, Nola? Hear what? Shh! Listen, said Nola, putting a finger on her lips. There's someone else in the wood grove whistling. I've never heard anyone whistle like that before. Such a beautiful tune. Izzy hurriedly put down the champagne and the glasses, throwing them casually against an old oak tree. She quickly grabbed her sister's hands. Come, let's go and see who it is. Aren't you curious? But we need to be quiet. The two girls crept furtively through the trees, like FBI agents moving towards a suspicious target. The girls switched off their torches and moved closer and closer towards the sound. Izzy put her fingers on her lips again. Look, can you see it? It's over there. It's absolutely humongous. You must be very quiet. We don't want it to know we're here. In a soft opening through the trees, the moonlight bounced over an ambiguously obscure silhouette, caressing ponderous shoulders
overlong arms, and a humanoid figure that was covered in long flowing hair and was easily over 7 foot tall. "It's a Bigfoot," whispered Nola excitedly. "It's a Bigfoot." The Bigfoot was clearly female, as she had breasts. She was whistling a pretty tune and appeared to be bending down on the forest floor, with her sizable hands brushing away leaves and twigs, as if looking for something that she had dropped. But very suddenly she looked up, reminding Nola of a dog when its ears perk up, as if she'd heard something. Then all of a sudden the deep-set, dark, treacle-coloured eyes spinned towards the trees, where Nola and her sister were hiding. She ambled towards them in a straight trajectory. How could she have heard them? They had been so terribly quiet. Nola wanted to run away as fast as she possibly could. While she was curious and intrigued about this mysterious Bigfoot, a personal encounter with such an intimidating beast was not something that she would gladly welcome. The two sisters clutched each other tightly, and Nola's bladder burst as a warm liquid descended down her legs. She had never been this afraid before. She wanted to run away, but her legs failed to oblige her. She felt like a tree rooted to the spot, unable to move. Her legs had become like heavy concrete blocks. She winced in pain as Izzy's long fingernails clawed into her skin so hard that Nola was sure she had drawn blood. Her mind was screaming, "For God's sake, run! What the hell is wrong with you?" Her body began to shake involuntarily like a leaf, and suddenly all the blood drained away from her face. She became so light-headed that she fainted and passed out, collapsing under the tree. The Bigfoot stood there, tall and majestic, staring at Izzy. But when Izzy saw her beautiful brown eyes, all her former fear dissipated. The Bigfoot quickly dashed over to Nola and began to slap her cheeks. But when Nola opened her eyes, she found herself staring up into a Bigfoot's face. She became so consumed with terror that she passed out again. The creature slapped her cheeks, and a voice screamed into her head, "I'm not going to hurt you. I didn't mean to scare you. I'm very sorry." This time Nola's eyes opened, and she looked up into the most beautiful eyes she'd ever seen. All her fears dissipated as the Bigfoot helped her to her feet. Nola noticed that Izzy was staring at the Bigfoot with a transfixed expression on her face, as if she was completely beguiled by the creature. All of a sudden the Bigfoot looked directly at Izzy, as if she'd been reading her thoughts. She put her hand on her heart and spoke to Izzy in a strange language. "Itantuakisa, hofokoshanasipa, igana silapo." Be glad he got away. Some things are not meant to be. Let your anger go. The words were translated into the girls' heads in English, and they stared at the Bigfoot with bemused expressions. "I don't understand. You're talking about Piers. How can you know about him?" "Itantuasifo, ishakatala putonola, isafolobojona." "Your mind is an open book to me," said the Bigfoot. "I can read it easily. But let your anger go, for you will be glad you did so. For do not curse the grace of the universe. It has your best interests at heart." It was good to meet you both. Then she was gone, just like that. Both girls were left staring at each other bewildered, saying, "Did that really happen?" Even years later, that event seemed so surreal to them, but happen it did. And just like the Bigfoot had said, Izzy let it go. The following morning she told Piers, "I'm sorry, I can't marry you." There were no tantrums, no accusations, no shenanigans. It would seem Izzy's encounter with the Bigfoot had helped her end her relationship with a graceful dignity. When people questioned her decision to call off the wedding, she shrugged her shoulders and said, "Some things are not meant to be," and that was that. Izzy was to meet the love of her life 18 months after her breakup with Piers, and she claims she owes the stoic way she handled her relationship with Piers to the wisdom of a Bigfoot. "I don't know how to explain it to you," she said. "That Bigfoot was so incredibly wise. She knew things about me and about my life path. She explained that I should let it go, and what was never meant to be was just not meant to be. You would be wise to do the same, for the universe will open doors for you that need to be open, and shut the ones you were never meant to walk through. So there you are. That's my story."
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.